Good evening, everyone. It is 5:30, so we will call the meeting to order. The first item on our agenda this evening is the Pledge of Allegiance. If everyone would please rise with me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Our next item is to adopt the agenda. Do I have a motion to adopt the agenda?
So moved or second.
Thank you, Dr. Sinclair and Ms. Goodburn. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Moving on to public comment. We have 4 people speaking this evening. We begin with Mr. John Segal.
First up again. Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you again. When I was here a few weeks ago, I was pleading that, or hoping that we would take a more conservative approach to things, and obviously that has not. Oh, I need to give you my name and address, don't I?
Well, you don't need to give your address, but if you do have a school that you're affiliated with, that'd be great.
Ray Marsh. I have
Thank
2
you.
kids at Ray Marsh, so sorry about that. Yeah, so last time when I was here, oh, you got a timer, you want to start it?
Sorry, it's not starting.
Okay,
okay.
I won't go over it. Anyway, I had asked you to take the conservative approach, which seemed to have been the way that we were doing things. But since then, we have not done that. And in fact, I think that the board and unfortunately the county have succumbed to people bullying them into lowering the standards, departing from what I think the CDC recommendations are. When I look at all of you, and then think of my kids being in a full model at school, they're not being as distant as you are. You guys are all 6 feet apart. They're going to be trying to stay 3 feet apart, which for elementary kids is hard enough. And I just think it's totally abdicating our responsibility and what the CDC recommendation is on the 6-foot standard. So I think that the county and you all have been bullied to some degree by people in this community whose main objectives are to get their kids playing sports or get them out of their hair in some cases, or there are people who have to physically go to work. I'm not one of those people. I can work from home. So I think that you should take the greater community approach and say, we're going to let people who have to go to school or have to go to work send their kids to school, and the rest of you, our recommendation is to have them stay home from school and do remote learning. And I can tell you that my kids had been signed up for the in-person, like I was saying last time. We have gone to remote only now, and it is being very successfully executed by the excellent teachers we have. So my kudos to the staff, but I think that we are sending the wrong message by making people think that it's okay, we're headed in a direction that's positive when we still really don't know where we're going. The situation is still very dangerous, and I think that you should go back to a system where you recommend that people stay home from school if they can and only go to school when they have to because their parents have to be at work. So that's my request to you as just a reasonable person based and not a scientific expert. Ignore the bullying, stick to the science, and if the people don't like it, that's too bad. Sometimes that's what you have to do as a public official. You have to stick to what you know and take a conservative approach to things and not base it on what our hopes are for the future. So that's my ask of you, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you and look forward to watching you online and seeing how you deliberate. And I also hope that your deliberations are much more open than they have been, and that there's no crime in debating topics. You can be civil and disagree with one another, and that's what I would ask you to do. Be a lot more transparent and forthcoming and reflect probably the discussions you have with your families at home and all of us have. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker this evening is Ms. Lisa Feingold.
Regardless of the learning model, stage, or position on school reopening, everyone benefits from clear, relevant communications both internally and externally. They are a vital piece of district function and community engagement and continue to be SMSD's Achilles heel. After the last meeting, county update reports from the health department and timing of secondary's hybrid announcement, it's clear that we need accurate, unambiguous information, starting with the board's reopening resolution. Lots of people are still confused about how reopening decisions are made and by whom, understandably so. Many think the board voted on and district leadership agreed to follow Johnson County's gating criteria on 7/27 because that's the message regularly conveyed by district leadership and some members of the board, but that's not the case. The resolution states the board affirms the district's reopening plan informed by actionable criteria, not to follow it. The board voted to pass the resolution on 7/27 and hand the reins to district administrators. Being informed by is not the same as following. Does the district plan to follow or be informed by the county's hybrid contract tracing, reporting, and quarantine recommendations, as that information isn't included in the 10/2 breaking news post? Some have addressed the board speaking on behalf of the majority of the community. The truth is, no one has gathered information from the majority of the SMSD community, including the district itself. A minority of guardians responded to July's thought exchange. A minority of parents are extremely vocal and retained attorneys to lobby on their behalf. A minority of the district population protested at unsafe distances right outside the front door of this building. Some parents call the inability to watch homecoming games tragic, while others are losing their jobs and struggling to secure homes and basic necessities. Are you not concerned that you're not engaging with the majority of the district community? Maybe they've asked questions only to be ignored or given a vague scripted answer. Maybe their student is unable to access classes necessary to reach their full potential. Maybe they think the district prioritizes certain students based on criteria that does not include them. Maybe they've been referred to a collection agency or don't think the district will help. Maybe they're afraid of negative repercussions if they speak up with their concerns. Leadership must intentionally engage with the entire district community. If teachers can meet 10 to 15 kids per class period, 6 sessions per day, you can find a way to discuss how to make education more successful and inclusive. Our district is a living system, and information needs to flow from the classroom to administrators, the board, and back to the community. Without timely and accurate communications, people won't know about Student Support Central or what useful information and tools are available. It's obvious that guiding people how to navigate student devices reduces classroom troubleshooting time and frustration. I've come to the realization that leadership isn't interested in engaging with the community to identify and share the most common obstacles and successes to date with COVID learning, but what improvements would help increase positive outcomes. I'm certain you'll know where to find me when it's time to dust off the bond issue. Thanks.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Mr. Peyton Cook. Or Miss Peyton Cook, my apologies.
I live in Shawnee and attend Shawnee Mission North, and this is my first year at high school. And I was well aware that it was going to be different than middle school and because of COVID, but this is not in the range of what I expected. The workload is noticeably different than what it would be in person, and I know that for a fact. Many upperclassmen have talked about it as well, so I know it's just not a freshman being unfamiliar with the new workloads. There will always be lazy people who don't want to do work, but when there's AB honor roll students getting F's, D's, and C's, there's an obvious problem. I am not in any way trying to make it so teachers don't assign anything, but there could be many things done differently. First off, teachers could easily combine 3 to 4 assignments into one. They seem to expect too much from us, even while we're in a stressful pandemic that will definitely impact the rest of our lives. Being assigned 2 to 4 things in one class and in one and more class a day is just too much. Just because we are at home does not mean we will dedicate more time to staring at our screen doing unnecessary busy work. Secondly, we are on our computers for 7 hours in a row. You do realize how awful headaches can be from technology, and it has been proven that screen time often leads to blurred vision, eye strain, and long-term vision problems like nearsightedness. It is insanely difficult to sit around all day having to do work, then get bad grades from some teachers' lack of instruction. We're supposed to ask questions, but then get told that we aren't paying attention or should ask a friend. There are students who are failing because a teacher is not doing their job, and they're the ones who get in trouble for it. When a student fails a class, some might get grounded or even get their phone taken away, which could be the only reason why they're happy or getting through the whole pandemic. There were over 6 months to find out a solid teaching method, but you waited till the last minute to get schedules and everything. You can't push stuff off to the last minute. If students can't, neither can the staff. Changes can be made, and if they were, I believe many more students would try harder. We're all giving up at this point, and it isn't our fault. We would all try harder if you guys did too. Hardly any of our teachers are checking in on us, asking if we're okay, if something is going on at home, etc. If a certain amount of students are missing something or failing a class, they should reach out. But I don't see much of that happening. We need something to change, and if at all possible, it would be amazing if you guys were the ones to initiate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Miss Amber Pagan.
Hello, my name is Amber Pagan. Good evening, board members and Dr. Fulton. I'm a pre-K teacher at Neiman Elementary. I'm here to speak on behalf of the upcoming bond issue and to persuade you to go with option C, which earmarks $3 million to remodel the Early Childhood Center, which is currently housed in the old Broadmoor building. I am a parent of 2 former SMSD students who attended all of the early childhood programs in the Shawnee Mission School District. We began our early childhood journey with parents as teachers when my oldest son was 1.5 years old. When he turned 2 years old, he became a peer model at the technology building on 103rd and Row. Later, he became a peer model when he was 3 and 4 years old at the old Catherine Carpenter building on 95th Street. My youngest son also attended Parents as Teachers while it was housed at the old Catherine Carpenter and then was a 3-year-old peer model in the same building. He then attended Title I Pre-K at Rose Hill Elementary. As a parent, I am very pleased with the early childhood experiences my boys received, along with the amazing educators they both had throughout our 6 years. As a community member, I have heard nothing but good things about the Parents as Teacher programming, early childhood programming, and the dedicated educators. Having taught in multiple districts in Kansas and Arizona, our early childhood center is lacking. Although the buildings have been repurposed, they were not meant for children birth to 4. However, the staff have always tried to make the space inviting for these young children. I applaud your ability to recognize the need to remodel this space. However, option A and B does not seem to provide enough funds to cover all the needs to be addressed at the Broadmoor Center. Here's the feedback I received from staff members at the Early Childhood Center. Add toddler/preschool-sized toilets to the bathrooms. Add water fountains at an appropriate height for small children on foot or with disabilities. Replace the lockers with cubbies to hold coats and backpacks. Reassess the distance between classrooms, playgrounds, offices, nurses' offices, etc., because the kids, it's just very tiring on those little ones to travel so far. And in addition, make the playground equipment age appropriate and adaptable, which I know you just purchased that. Increase classroom size and install sinks and bathrooms for the kids that are not so far away that the kids can't reach the soap dispensers or the sink, because we really work towards independence in these young ages. This will cut down on the potty accidents. Also increase dedicated space for storage and remove the stairs, making the building one level. If our little learners can't get a new building, they need a space that is created just for them. I've just listed a few of the modifications needed, but the building is in need of some massive updates and remodels to turn it into the proper early learning center our district and early childhood staff could call their own. Thank you for your attention to this matter. I have faith that you will choose option C because it makes the most sense. Thank you.
Thank you. We have public comment from 5:30 to 6, and when we don't have enough to fill that comment space, we then take a break until 6 o'clock because the 5:30 to 6 o'clock time is reserved for public comment, so the public can be here to listen, and then administrators come in to replace them after public comment concludes. So we will take a 15-minute recess and begin again at 6. Thank you very much. Okay, it is 6 o'clock. So the next item on our agenda is the strategic plan bond issue presentation. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Fulton and the team who's providing that presentation, and then we're going to have a discussion as a board once we receive all their information.
Great, thank you very much. Wonderful to see everyone tonight. I want to start off, first of all, by letting you know we are going to walk through this presentation. Most of the slides you have seen. In fact, they've been in the public domain for some time now. There's a few that are new, and I'll point those out. So I'm going to move through the presentation fairly quickly so that you can have lots of time for conversation. And then following this part of the agenda, we will have an update on reopening school with a special emphasis on understanding the revised, the updated gating criteria that the county's developed, and we'll have the chief epidemiologist from the county to present to us. So it's a very full evening, but it's exciting. We've got lots of good things to talk about. Before we get started, though, I want to turn to Dr. Atha and ask him to please introduce some guests that we have here this evening. Dr. Atha?
Thank you, Dr. Fulton. I'll introduce a couple of people you already know. Russell Knapp, our Chief Financial Officer. He'll be prepared to answer any questions regarding school finance, regarding the discussion this evening. And then Bob Robinson, our Executive Director of Facilities. He'll be able to answer any questions as it relates to option A, option B, and option C that you will be discussing this evening. Our special guest, one is on his way, and I'll introduce him when he arrives. He got caught up at a railroad crossing for about 10 minutes, and so we'll introduce him when he gets here. But David Arterberry. David is our financial advisor for the district. He's with Stiefel, Nicholas and Company, and he'll be able to address questions regarding the bond referendum as it relates to options A, B, and C, and the impact. He's the one that calculated the impact of these three options on the district's mill levy that Dr. Fulton will be presenting later on. Next up is Gina Rehoff, and Gina is bond counsel for the district. She works for Gilmore and Bell. She'll be able to answer questions regarding the election process, as well as the timeline, as well as a bond referendum resolution that will come before you at our next board meeting for your consideration. So she'll be able to answer any and all of those types of questions. Ken, glad you made it.
Yes, thank you. The train slowed me down by about 10 minutes.
Well, I'm just glad you stopped.
Well, anyway, my car's fine.
And Ken, I think you're a former graduate of Shawnee Mission West. Okay, and Ken is president and owner of Patron Insight, and as you know, he conducted the 2020 Community Telephone Survey that is providing a lot of data that will be considered this evening. And I think we presented that report become final on July 30th. So it's still relatively fresh information, as well as you know, July 30th was right in the midst of COVID-19. So with that said, I'm glad you're here this evening to help provide as a resource for the board as they have a robust discussion on the potential of running a bond referendum maybe in January 26th. Dr. Fulton, back to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Again, I'm going to move through these slides fairly quickly. It's just a refresher for the board. You've seen most of this information. And then when I'm done, then I'll turn it over to President Owsley for a board conversation. And we're here as resources to respond to any questions that you might have or clarifications on how bond issues work. So let's start off where we always begin, and that's with our mission. A real focus on making sure that we're centered on children and meeting their needs, and then doing everything we can as well to work with our staff to make sure that they are successful in working with our students to support them in their learning. We continue to really focus on our 5 strategies this year, along with our 3 areas of focus. You know, it's interesting, these workshops were set up to really spend the bulk of our time on the strategic plan. And this very much is about our strategic plan tonight. one of the things that we're doing with our strategic plan is we're providing updates from time to time, both here in these workshops, but also online. And so recently we've updated our Gantt charts. They show the progress that we're making on each of our areas that we've identified. So I would just direct you and the public as a whole to go to our website and look at the progress that we're making on our strategic plan. This one specifically deals with facilities, and I won't go into all the details of it. But we are making progress on a process that really started back in the 2018-2019 school year. The plan was approved in June of 2019, and we've been working it ever since. That wasn't that long ago, a little over a year and a few months. Tonight, we're going to really focus in on strategy 4, action plan 2, action step 2, and that's using data to inform our decisions, so you have a lot of data in front of you. And so that hopefully will be helpful as you think through what we might want to do with a potential bond issue. And then specifically, strategy 5, what do we need to do to make sure that we have state-of-the-art facilities that support the learning process? As we've gone through this work, we've really spent a lot of time in study, planning before we actually get to action on these items. So tonight we're at a point where the board can have a good conversation on what action might we want to take related to a bond issue. As a reminder, we have several sources of funding. The operating fund pays for salaries, benefits, daily operating expenses, and so on. And one of the things that we've done in our planning process is we've said, you know, it's really important when you're addressing the operating fund to have minimum balances. And so we've identified this recommended guardrail of a minimum of 8.3% or 1 month's expenses, whichever is greater, to make sure that we're safeguarding ourselves, to have adequate funds in place to meet payroll and other kinds of needs when it comes to our staff. We also, as part of our strategic plan, as it pertains to operating funds, recognize a real need to reduce secondary workload. And so the only way you can reduce secondary workload is by increasing teachers. We identified up to about 78.5 FTE that needed to be added to the school district in grades 7 through 12 to reduce workload. And that reducing workload directly ties into our 3 objectives of personalized learning plans, college and career readiness, and life skills needed for interpersonal skills needed for life success. So we came up with a 2-year plan. Now the 2-year plan was contingent on some variables such as the state meeting their funding obligations and us having what we need to do as it relates to having adequate funds in our operating fund to make this work. So we talked about next year moving $2.3 million of custodial and maintenance from operating into capital, doing the same thing with $2.2 million the following year. And then we were left with $1.3 million that we had to identify that needed to come from new state operating revenue. Good news is, as previously shared during the course of interest-based bargaining, we were able to identify $921,000 that has been allocated for this purpose for next year. So we're close. We're getting really close to the 1.3 additional million that's needed. But we can't do the 2.3 million or the 2.2 million without passing a bond issue. We also have talked about the fact that if we're going to do this effectively, then we're going to have to move custodial and maintenance salaries from operating into capital. And then in the capital fund, we're going to have to move money we have been using for rebuilds and some other things into a bond issue. And so it's important to remember that as we make these shifts, that we need to think about putting a hard cap of 25% in capital in order to make sure that we don't overstretch those capital funds, because we're still going to need a lot of capital funds to deal with ongoing routine maintenance. You get a sense of what that looks like with our capital revenue here of about $35 million. You can see for this year and the next 2 years what effect that movement of moving custodial maintenance salaries from operating into capital has on the capital budget. We've got that all planned out, so it's covered as long as we stick to our game plan. This is a reminder of the timeline of the planning process that we've been through. There's been quite a bit of work done on identifying facility needs over the last several years, and we've been working this process now for some time. Also, as a reminder, you might find this interesting, we have a lot of facility needs in the district. We have 34 elementary schools, 6 high schools, and 5 middle schools. We have 5,400,000 square feet of facilities. That's a lot of square footage. And you can get an idea there on this pictorial of the different kinds of additional needs that we have to meet in order just to keep Shawnee Mission up and running on a daily basis. Through this process, we've identified our most immediate needs. All buildings have certain things, such as technology and security upgrades, that have to be addressed. We want to do renovations for our early childhood center and also for a career tech center. We have very specific schools and buildings, or that we have schools and buildings that have specific needs around things like HVAC, lighting, and so on. At the elementary level, we've talked about doing rebuilds, so we can discuss that more tonight, and also playground equipment. And then, of course, at the middle school and high school, they have lots of facility needs as well because they're older buildings. But that's also critical to get a bond issue passed to have a pathway to address teacher workload. So we have a little pictorial for you here that you might find helpful as it comes to this whole question of the interrelationship between the operating fund, the capital fund, and the role that bond plays. You know, one of the things that we have right now is we have facilities that are built out of capital. With this movement of custodial maintenance from operating into capital, we'll no longer have capacity to do new construction out of capital. That is all going to have to be done with bond issue money. So we cover as much as we can in the bond to free up money in the capital fund up to that hard cap of 25%, to then move some more of the custodial maintenance salaries into capital. And what that does is it frees up money in the operating fund then to hire additional teachers. You can see everybody's happy when that happens, right? So it's a very simple pictorial that kind of tells the story of what we're doing here. But none of this can happen without a bond issue. That is critical in order for us to move forward. Now, one of the things that we did this summer, as you recall, is we had Patron Insight go out and do a survey. This is a science-based survey with 500 folks who were contacted and participated in a phone interview. Those results were shared with you on August 10th. The survey results, which were pretty robust, came up with a number of findings, but one of them had to do with the what ifs. What if we asked patrons to do something that would amount to a $22 annual increase per 100,000 home value? Would you be in favor of that rate increase? And 63% said that they would strongly favor. And there's about a plus or minus 5% margin of error on this. Ken can talk about that in more depth later if you have questions. And you can see for the next two, what happens if it's $8. We see that number go up to 78% would strongly favor. That's meaningful because there's a statistically significant difference between that 63% and the 78%. And then, of course, what if there's no tax rate increase to do a bond issue? It goes up to 83%. There's no significant difference between 78% and 83%. So, last we talked, we had two options on the table. We had an option A and an option B. So I'll quickly review those, and we'll talk about option C, which has been added in. Option A is a no tax rate increase to the mill levy. That gives us about $187 million. It does leave quite a bit of work yet to be done in the next two bond issues. Now, as a reminder, and this is important, as a board and even as superintendent, we're obviously dealing with the moment, right? We're dealing with today's money. This does not obligate future boards to these amounts, but what it does say is that in order to meet the current goals and expectations of the board and of the community, it would be critical to be thinking about the need for additional bond money going forward. And so we've given a blueprint, a game plan, if you will, for ourselves and for future superintendents and boards to follow if they wish. Now, you can tweak it a little bit, you can adjust things, but the game plan is solid in terms of what's needed to keep our facilities in good shape, keep our bonding capacity where it needs to be, address our capital needs, and also keep our operating revenue in a place where we can continue to reduce workload for secondary. Option B, that was the one that involved a little bit bigger tax rate increase. And in this scenario, well, in the question that was posed, it was $22 per 100,000. This one actually would be about $31 per 100,000. That generates about $341 million. And then what that does, though, is that it means you have less of a tax rate increase in the next two bond issues. And then finally, option C, that's an increase of about $8 per $100,000 home value. And that generates about $264 million. So quite a bit more than option A, and not as much as option B. And it does kind of equalize out what would happen with the next two bonds. You can see very similar amounts of money there. And some gradual increases in what the tax levy would be. Now, the good news in all of this is that even under this set of assumptions, when you get through that third bond issue, you're looking at mill levies, whether it's option A, option B, or option C, that are well below our Johnson County peers. So that's encouraging. So we're not asking to go too far out there. We still have a very good mill levy rate compared to our colleagues in the rest of the county. So there's the overview. What are the next steps? Tonight is really about a board conversation around what you see as being the best option moving forward. The next step after that is to approve a bond resolution. Now, if you were to go for a bond proposal in January, on January 26th, you would need to pass that bond resolution at the October 26th board meeting as awareness. If we miss that date, then a January ballot for a bond is not going to be possible. You'll have to push it off later into the spring. My recommendation is that we look at that January 26th date, place a bond referendum on the ballot for January 26th, and that we consider the best route forward. Is it A, is it B, or is it C? And what I've done for you there is kind of given my thinking, our team's thinking, on a way to approach this. So, for example, when you look at level of community support, it's pretty clear that A and C have strong levels of support, B a little less. And I won't go through each of these. They all provide a pathway for secondary teachers. They all do a good job of maintaining and addressing current facilities. You get more school rebuild options out of B and C than you do out of A. And all of them can have the scope of the work managed effectively, but B is going to require probably an extended timeline because B has a lot of work in it. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, President Owsley, and for a board conversation.
Okay. Thanks, Dr. Fulton. So instead of going around in a circle tonight, we wanted to have an actual discussion between the board members about what our issues or concerns, or if we have direct questions for anyone, to raise them tonight. So I'm not going to go around in a circle. So I don't know who would like to start off this evening. If maybe we could hear from Brad or Mary and the Finance Facilities Committee, if they had any thoughts to add to this, or if we wanted to you know, get a feel for where everyone was at or what the questions were. I'm open to whatever the ideas are. Yeah, that'd be great, Brad.
As it relates to the Finance and Facilities Committee, I was looking at this timeline and jotting down a note that I will see if we can't make sure to have that group gather next week, so the week of the October 19th, in order to get their feedback that would be helpful for an eventual decision the following week. So
Right, for the vote the following week, that would be great.
Yeah, so I just want to set that out there, that gives us a week to plan it and a week to have the meeting.
Okay. Well, I mean, I can lead off with some of my just initial thoughts on the three. I think B is attractive in that we get to get a lot done. A is attractive in that it has a significant amount of community support, and it's probably the least risk because it's the lowest amount and it doesn't involve a tax increase. And then C seems to be a nice middle-of-the-road approach where we can still get some building work done while keeping the increase to only $8 a year, so per 100,000. So it seems like there's three decent options to choose from. It's just figuring out which path we want to take and what level of risk we'd be comfortable with and how much we want to get done out of the gate. So it looks like, do you have comments, Dr. Sinclair?
How could you tell?
You were a little twitchy.
You know? I'm not sure, Dr. Fulton, if you're the person to ask this, can you elaborate a little bit? We have heard some of this information before, and we've heard about option A and option B, and option C seems to come from information that was a third option that seemed to be informed by the response of the community survey. If that's accurate, could you all maybe speak to that a little bit more?
I can, and it was absolutely informed by the results of the survey. That was not an option that originally we'd constructed, but you know, we were curious when we were working with Ken on the survey about that whole issue. Is there something in between? And so we posed that question. Sure enough, when the survey results came back, there was a lot of interest in something, maybe a little less than what option B was proposing. So with that information, we then went and put together option C as a result. So that was responsive to what the community was saying.
And so those changes then, like if I'm looking at the difference between option B and option C, it seems like one of the pieces that, so there's a smaller incremental, it's a little bit smaller bond that first round. So there's less of an increase per, you know, $100,000 in home value to the homeowners of the Shawnee Mission area. And then the primary difference seems to be the pace in which new buildings would be would be constructed. So the option B has six schools, option C, 5 schools. So can you clarify, that doesn't mean that only those 5 schools would be rebuilt. It would just be that those additional schools would be proposed in a subsequent bond?
Right, so that's an important point of clarification. So when we look at option A, for example, you have 4 schools. And there are 2 others identified in the other 2 options. There are 5 schools in option C, 6 schools in option B. Any school that is not in one of those options, say A or C, it doesn't mean that they're off the list. It just means that they would have to be picked up in the next bond issue. In fact, we've identified 6 schools for purposes of these 3 options because that's the money that's available. There are other schools beyond those 6 that in future bond issues would be candidates for rebuild as well. This is just a list that we have in front of us at the moment. So that's very important to clarify. It doesn't mean that if a school doesn't make a rebuild list this time, it doesn't mean that they won't make the next rebuild list. And it's been that way, as I understand, for quite some time when it comes to the rebuilds. You can only do so many in any given bond issue.
But to clarify, though, if we choose, let's just say we choose option C, all of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, these 5 would go in that first round. And then the subsequent rounds would be completely different buildings. But, so it's not like just 2 of them are going to go in the first, I mean, all of these, whatever's in this would be going in that first bond, right?
That's correct.
Okay. We're not stringing them out over, we're not, so if they're on this list, they're going in that first round.
Yes.
Okay.
I have a question. So the Shawnee Mission community is historically been very supportive of teachers. And when you say bond, obviously that's brick and mortar. So how will the bond, I'm not sure who to address this to exactly, but how will the bond be worded so that the community knows that we are addressing teacher workload with the bond issue?
So I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Atha, and I'm going to let him delegate. But I will say this. When you write up a bond resolution, there are very specific legal requirements that you have to meet. Some of the issues, like the one you addressed of teacher workload, can be addressed in bond resolutions, but often what you find is you have to address that through the information that you send out to your community, because you can't legally put all of it into the bond resolution. So I'll just turn it over to Dr. Atha.
Before I call on Gina to get a little more into the bond referendum resolution, I'd like to add a little more to what Dr. Fulton said in reference to, if you give the go-ahead, if you pass a bond resolution on October 26th, then at that point, moving forward, all the way till January 26th, we will be putting out information not only at the board meeting, but also throughout the community, letting them know exactly what Dr. Fulton has went over here to be able to address the teacher workload that we all want to address. This is the pathway through a bond in order to be able to move custodians out of operations move custodians out of operations into the capital outlay. This will be the pathway that we can do that and meet the workload issue for teachers. And I think we got to keep that information out there before the community so that they know that this plan is bigger than bricks and mortar. We have $750 million worth of facility needs. We have teacher workload to address, and we can address that through this cumulative plan. Does that make sense, Jamie?
100% agree.
But you got to keep getting that information. As an administrator, as a superintendent, we cannot go out and say, vote yes for this. But we can put out the very best information, accurate information as to what the taxpayer gets for the investment that they make. And it's more than bricks and mortar.
Yeah, absolutely.
Although that's important too.
So I
Right.
have,
So
I have a follow-up to that, though.
So-
Are you asking, like, the language on the bond itself when people go to vote? Because I think that that's pretty tightly controlled by statute and legal requirements, and she's nodding over there, so we might have her speak to that.
yeah, I'd like
Yeah.
further clarification.
Yeah.
Yeah, good evening, Gina Rekoff. Great to be here with all of you tonight. So you're exactly right. There are very specific legal requirements about what the ballot language needs to look like. And generally what you're asking voters is whether the school district has the authority to issue bonds in a specific principal amount, and then you ask voters for permission about what you can spend those proceeds on. Now, I will tell you that we generally advise, there is some very specific language in the statute, and most of our clients parrot the language in the statute to give you broad authority to spend those bond proceeds on all the sorts of capital facilities that are permitted to be paid for out of the bond proceeds. I think that Dr. Atha is spot on, though. I'll frankly tell you, we tell most of our clients that the way that your patrons find out how you're going to spend the bond proceeds, the way they look to you to tell them, you know, what you're going to do is this educational campaign. It's very rarely just the language that's in the ballot. In fact, that's usually sort of the afterthought for your voters. They're really looking to you in that educational campaign to explain to them the very specific things that you've been talking about in the past 15 or 20 minutes here about what are you going to do with your facilities. But from a legal standpoint, the ballot language is basically, can we repair, remodel, improve school district facilities and buildings, and improve them for school district purposes? Can we make other improvements to our facilities? That's generally what the ballot language looks like. And then that gives you the flexibility so that you can, because when you vote that bond issue, as you've seen on the presentation tonight, that's a multi-year plan. And that gives you the flexibility to implement that multi-year plan with lots of specificity about exactly what HVA system and what building are you going to improve. And frankly, that's not something that you're going to put in the ballot language. I hope that helps. I'd be happy to answer any follow-up questions.
Ms. Goodburn?
Well, and the ballot language also wouldn't have like, and your property taxes will go up $8 for every 100,000. I mean, it's not going to explain all that. So that's all part of the campaign too, that our information that we put out about, you know, how much they would have to pay, right?
Yes,
Correct.
that's exactly right. That is not in the ballot language.
Reverend Guy?
So the schools that have been identified as rebuilds, I'm looking at option C right now specifically. So we have them covering most of our attendance areas, but I noticed there are 2 from the east area and none from the northwest area. So I just wanted to hear, are those schools in better shape, or why is it that we have 2 from the east area and none from the northwest?
I will yield to Bob Robinson, who's, he and his team, as well as architects, have done a study of our buildings. So Bob, you want to address that?
Happy to. Most of the buildings in the northwest area are a little newer. That's the newer part of the district. What we undertook in 2016 through 19 was to evaluate our 10 oldest schools, high schools and middle schools, and these are the ones that bubbled to the top that needed work. So that's how we come up with this list. But I think you'll see, my recommendation would be that you do whichever plan you pick today, and then 3 years from now, 4 years from now, you reevaluate the older schools again, and then you would generate your second list from that, not from the data we have right now. Wait 3 years and then generate again.
So as a follow-up, if the board decides on one of these options and pursues this in a bond, are we obligated to rebuild these named schools in this document? Or I'm just thinking hypothetically, if we discover structural damage in another school, can we switch out one of these for a school in greater need?
Not sure.
I can answer that part. I think once you put the list out, then that's your commitment to the community, and you want to stay with that list. Now, as Bob was saying too, let's say you do some of the schools on the list, but not all of the schools on the list. You'd want to give assurances that the other schools that didn't make it on the list this time, those are going to be right in the mix for anything that happens in the future. There'll be other schools that will enter in as well, but these are clearly 6 schools that have the greatest need for a rebuild. But yeah, once we make a decision like that, then it's a commitment to the community that this in fact is what we'll do.
I would also like to remind you that Benninghoven was rebuilt, and it was in the northwest, and it did happen in the last bond referendum. And I'd go a little further than what Dr. Fulton said in reference to the commitment on this list, because we'll be giving regular reports. If we pass a bond, we'll be giving regular updates. And basically what's on this list becomes a promise and a commitment, as Dr. Fulton said. So people will be watching to make sure that we honor the promise that we make.
I'm interested to hear what the differences are besides the number of elementary schools, because we had someone come during public comment and point out that
the early education center was getting the highest amount of money with option C. I kind of assumed they were in some sort of a progression of like A would give the least, B would give the most, C would give a mid-grade amount. And like, just what are the other differences? Like I see option C has tearing down the old Catherine Carpenter building, but that's not on option A or option B. If you could just, aside from the elementary school thing, what are the other differences we should be aware of?
I mean, they're similar to each other. We have those on that PowerPoint if you'd like to take a look at them. But the real difference is, and there is a difference because the total dollars, so we had to make sure the total dollars work. So we may have had, I think in the original C, we had $3 million for renovation of the early childhood center. In a couple of the other ones, it was $2,500,000. So it wasn't a whole lot difference, but it was some difference in there. And as we interviewed architects just 2 weeks ago, our question to each group was, what is the cost per square footage that it's going to cost us to build these schools? So the numbers they gave us was a little higher of what I was using originally. So I had to go back and adjust those dollars slightly to cover the new data that we just received in the last 2 weeks. So everything kind of adjusted a little bit at that point to get to the total that the bond dollars that we have available. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
It does, thank you.
Dr. Fulton's going to try and pull them up so we can have them on the screen too, if we want to run through them or not.
Yeah, the problem is I really can't the way, unfortunately, I can't the way this is set up.
Okay.
So it'll cause me to get out of the entire presentation. So that's,
Well, never mind.
my apologies on that. But it is available online and they can pull it up there in front. Sorry about that.
You know, Mrs. Hembry, you point out a good point in reference to the tear down of old Carpenter building. That's where our early childhood center was located. And we were always going to tear it down at some point, but we could have used capital outlay to tear it down. But when we developed the option C, it just seemed to be a good place to put this into the bond.
Ms. Embry, I found some more of those details from a previous meeting on June 8th. So if you, there's the bond option A and then a bond option B PDF from that meeting that has far more detail. I think that probably Dr. Fulton was referring to. So
Yeah,
if you want to peruse that, it's in there.
If you look at his proposal, they've changed slightly, so make sure you look at the newest data.
Right, the updated A, B, and C are current and are added into our board agenda tonight. So those numbers that you see tonight are slightly revised from what you saw earlier.
That's true, because there's no C. You're right. Yep.
But some of the numbers stay the same through the three. The HVAC, the elementary furniture, the ADA upgrades and additions, do those all stay the same, or are they slightly tweaked?
They had to be tweaked just a little bit because we added more to the elementary rebuilds. So to get to the total dollar, I had to tweak those numbers a little bit.
But there's not a significant difference.
No, ma'am.
Oh, go ahead, Mr. Stratton.
Part of this lengthy process is identifying need. And as I think about the other big elephant in the room, and that is we're in the middle of a pandemic. So my analogy that I've tried to work through mentally on this is it's like a flood. We can't really see what this is going to look like until the water recedes. And it could take a year or two before the water really recedes and we can see what our needs are going to be. That's my lead in to say, I'm looking at our schedules and saying, well, we've got this bond offering now, which these are identified needs, and when the water recedes, these needs will still be there. So I'm very comfortable with that. I'm just wondering, not only as we look to the voters to approve this, also how can we communicate what we anticipate the need to be? And my example would be changes in remote learning and things like that. You know, is when the water recedes from this flood, there's going to be new things identified. I would be very comfortable saying, well, that would be most likely addressed in the next bond offering, but I'm throwing that out as a question.
I think that's accurate. because we can't know exactly what all the needs are going to be down the road. But what we did in creating this is we looked at what was essential to do. You have roofs, windows, HVAC, those kinds of things that have to be done. You have rebuilds that really help keep the community fresh, so that's positive. And so, but you have to balance all that now, right? Because you're not going to have the capital dollars that we once used to have. So it's whatever those future needs are, they're going to have to come through the bond. Now we have, again, by doing that hard cap at 25% in capital, we have anticipated what future technology needs might be. So purchasing technology can still happen through capital and adequate numbers. But yeah, there's always going to be ongoing revision and review based on what the future holds.
Ms. Morgan?
So the poll, the phone survey that was taken in July, I mean, in the year 2020, 3 months is a lifetime, right? So much change has changed even since July, and how people feel about COVID and even about schools. We've lost a significant number of students in the district. And so I'm just wondering, do you think that the numbers, we can still trust the numbers that will have overwhelming support for a bond to be approved and at such a high success rate?
Did I do that right? Okay, good. That's a very good question, and I think about that all the time. And we are in a time of change, obviously. This was taken after people developed their opinion about how the district did in the spring. How did you effectively manage having school, in quotes, through an online format? Did you get lunches available and delivered? And with that kind of as the background, these are the numbers they provided. I think that you are going to see some softening of those numbers over time because people are just weary about COVID and what it's done to their lives. 63% would be good, very good in normal times. The other two suggest that I am willing to support the schools, but the optics look good. To me, they look good at $22 too. That's a pittance compared to some that we work with. But the middle is, as Dr. Fulton said, the difference is statistically significant. It's more than 5%. It's significantly more than 5%. So there's a better foundation there. I'm not telling you what to do or what not to do, but there is a better foundation there. It's when you get to a no tax increase, it's not statistically relevant. So that says to me, as a researcher, that they want to support the schools, and if you can make the number right, and you can talk benefits, benefits, benefits over and over and over as you present your informational campaign. It's not we're going to tear down and rebuild these schools. It's a matter of these schools are out of date for today's learning. I'm not writing your messages here, but that's what they said. They gave the district good brand commentary in the survey. You noticed in that exercise we call a statement exercise. It's all very positive. So what you need to do is reinforce what you're doing and why you're doing it. And I'm crushed that Catherine Carpenter's on the chopping block because I'm an alum of that too. So, but it survived the tornado, but it won't survive the district. We talked a lot about that tornado that hit and damaged the schools. Did that answer your question in a long-winded way? Okay. Thank you. Great.
Ms. Borgman, can I ask your same question from a mathematical perspective? So if the standard deviation around those any of those percentages on option A, B, and C is 5%. So even if we went negative by 2 standard deviations, any of those plans would still be above 50%, strongly in favor or in favor. The option B would just get dangerously close to that 50-50 mark.
That's true. Correct? That's true. And we are blessed to live in a simple majority state. So that gives us even more kind of wiggle room, and making that decision gives you more wiggle room. We have more COVID coming, we have a presidential election. So we are in a time of uncertainty. But again, you're not talking about giant numbers that people would have to commit for their home value. And so I think you should think about kind of what's best for the district and its students, and move forward in that perspective.
Yeah, and it just helps me gauge kind of the confidence in the community survey and where folks are at from that sample.
No, it's a very, very good question. And just as a reminder, we ask about the high dollar figure first, and anyone who said, yes, I can support that, didn't hear about the other two under the assumption that if they're okay at 22, they'll be fine at 8 and they'll be fine at no tax increase. Everybody else was asked about 8 and then the same process. If they were supportive, they didn't hear about no tax increase. And if they weren't, then we asked them about no tax increase. So those are cumulative totals that you see. Everybody who supported at higher amounts combined with everybody who jumped on board at 8, and then eventually with everybody who jumped on board at no tax increase. So that's where they come from.
And I get this sense that because there's not buildings that, in the last bond, we had the Aquatic Center and the CAA. I think these buildings all being related directly, people are really emotionally connected to their elementary schools. They're directly related to community investment in a way people see as super tangible. I mean, they walk past their local elementary school. And some of these elementary schools are in significant need of work, and then tying that also with workload reduction for educators. These directly speak to the members of our community, I think, in a way that is stronger, perhaps, than if we were building an additional facility during this particular time of uncertainty. Like it's the community investment is apparent on its face, and they're needed. So hopefully people will continue to have grace and support for that with any of the options. Although, again, the option B does get us close to being in a margin that's uncomfortable.
Can I ask just a math question about these numbers? Is inflation factored in for like the next two bonds in 26, 27 and 32, 33? Are those numbers with inflation?
We built in a 2% assessed valuation growth over the time period of the bonds.
Okay. So these numbers then, the $24 in the next bond issue, again, I'm looking at option C, and then 11 for the third one, those are adjusted. Okay.
That's correct.
So it's really just a matter of, we know what the needs are, it's just, are we going to do the bigger ask this first bond, or hopefully do the bigger ask in the second or third bond, when maybe we'll be over the pandemic and the economy will have stabilized and things will look a little brighter.
If I may bring back that into that, Russ, you might want to talk about, we'll walk through A, B, and C, because the numbers have shifted just a little bit since we looked at them last in terms of what the actual increase would be. 100,000. Do you want to talk
Sure.
about that? I'll put the slides up.
So the question that was posed in the survey, we worked out that scenario many months ago, prior to the pandemic, and that was based on a 3% assessed valuation growth, so that means your tax dollars would be a little bit lower. Then we came back and we worked out that same scenario for the June presentation. We were in a pandemic. Dave and I talked, and we thought we might be a little more conservative with the assessed valuation. We just used 2%, and so you can see how that tax dollar amount goes up. So you can see the negative effect, but the positive part of this, if our assessed valuation comes in higher, we typically are in the 5 to 6% range. So if we can get up that higher, these tax amounts would be lower than what we're estimating here.
So the 31 per 100,000 is a very conservative estimate, correct, Russ?
Yes.
So that's higher than the 22 that we did on the survey. We're looking at 31 for that, and then 8 for C, and of course A is no tax rate increase. I just wanted to clarify that. That's why the numbers look a little bit different because of the assumptions that were built.
I would sort of echo Brad's comment. I mean, one thing that was going through my head consistently looking through all this was not so much of a strong feeling about any one particular option, but this just nagging question of like, but what about COVID? But what about COVID? But what about COVID? And I was thinking to myself, I mean, what if these 1,500 kids don't come back? Maybe we've achieved our workload reductions right there because we don't have as many students. Or what if we decide to keep a remote option for high school and then we've achieved our workload reductions right there? And I don't know, I just kept thinking about all of the kind of uncertainty that COVID brings along with it. And the other question I kept going back to that might be a question for the administrative team is just how has the pandemic changed what we're prioritizing with our bond package? Because I know we've had a lot of conversations about HVAC and ventilation, and if we think COVID is around for a while, which I'm afraid it is, what do we need to be doing to make our schools? Like, does that necessitate any kind of different prioritization of a bond package that situates us better for safer instruction moving forward?
Okay, so we got a couple of questions there. One is, we have on the student enrollment, a lot of the loss in student enrollment happened at elementary, particularly in the lower grades, and we have already made adjustments in FTE for that because we had a number of positions that we didn't have to fill. So that's the good news there. For the secondary level, we didn't see as much drop in student enrollment at the secondary level. So I think the FTE that we've identified as being needed is likely to stick, or it'll be pretty close to it. So we don't see a lot of change there. We don't see a lot of change with building capacity needs at the moment. Of course, the big question mark there is how many students might continue to stay in remote permanently, and it's of course it's impossible to know that at the moment. We might have a better feel for that as the year goes on. So that's in the background, but we have done some analysis on that, and I think our assumptions are still okay. Now, on the question of on looking at other issues such as HVAC upgrades, that's something that I know that Bob has been looking into, and there's still some analysis we need to do, because the question becomes, what's the level of filtration system that's really needed to ensure that you can, for example, keep kids in school, get them in school, keep them in school, depending on what the ground conditions are with the virus. And that's data that we have to unpack some of that and do some more research. So I don't know, Bob, if you want to address that at all or not. Let me add this for a second. The jump from current assumptions in HVAC system designs from where we're at in schools to something that would be much more robust has a huge price tag to it. And while we don't have that number identified yet, we know it's big. As you can just imagine, go back to that little graphic with all those facilities, that's a lot of retrofitting of HVAC systems that you have to do, and they are not cheap. So Bob, I'll give that as a handoff to you.
Well, and he's right. That's a really hard question to answer. But one thing we will have on all the rebuilds, they will be updated. All the HVAC equipment that we have scheduled to be replaced will be updated. As we interviewed architects and engineers, we talked about that a little bit. What do you see change-wise and how we're doing our HVAC system as we build these new schools? Because that's more of a question to me. You know, if we're building new schools, we want to make sure that we're building to take care of our current and future needs. And they're saying right now they wouldn't make hardly any changes from what we've originally designed in the last 6 schools we've rebuilt. So it made me feel good that we were on the right track, but I think that changes every day. So by the time we start designing these, that could be a different answer. But all the HVAC equipment we put in the last 5-6 years in the bond issue was all able to handle the higher filters. So just by putting in new equipment, you're addressing many of those needs. Not district-wide by a long shot, but, you know, every building is one building closer.
Just a point of clarification. As we've informed you earlier, we were going to put out RFQs and RFP for our architects as well as construction firms. We just concluded those interviews on Friday of last week. We interviewed every applicant, every architectural firm that applied. We interviewed every construction firm, and Bob was consistent in answering those questions on ventilation, on cost per square footage to build a new building, that sort of thing. If we're going to proceed forward with a bond referendum, we need to get the architectural firms that we need on board. We need to get the construction firms on board that we need, because the goal would be, if we run it in January, the goal would be to try to have a couple of elementaries coming up out of the ground in June.
Well, I have a question going back just to clarify. With the folks in remote at the secondary level, it doesn't actually reduce the workload because we pull teachers to go with those kids who are in the at-home cadre. And so we have two schedules where the class size is still basically the same. It lowers overall the number of kids who are in the building every day when we're in hybrid, but the class sizes are still the same, and the workload that the teachers are pulling is still 6 out of 7, if I'm understanding how the schedules were crafted.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We did not decrease our FTE needs because of going to both a remote-only option and an in-school option. What it did do, though, is it made staffing a bit more challenging because it's, remote actually is a little bit easier to staff because you can bring it up to whatever your class size capacities are. But for in-class, it depends on how many students are in that grade level at that particular school. And so that made staffing actually a bit more challenging and at times a little bit more inefficient. But in general, I think we ended up in pretty good shape. Given the fact this is the first time we'd ever done it at the elementary and the secondary level.
I just wanted to follow up on Ms. Embry's question. Is the MERV 8 or the MERV 13 filter the new standard going forward? Is that what our new bonds will be using?
On all the schools we rebuilt last year, MERV 13s are available. Prior to the pandemic, we were using MERV 8s. We've went to MERV 11 for all our units, and we've got MERV 13s on order if we get them in, but they will have to be on a unit-by-unit basis on the older equipment to see if they will be able to work with that equipment or not.
Okay. Thank you. I have some questions for bond experts, but I just asked a question, so I can
You can
wait.
go.
Okay. Could you all speak, one of the parts of this presentation was thinking about a board policy around setting a minimum for cash reserves at 8.3%, and we've seen recommendations for 10 to 15% being 1 to 2 months of revenue for the district. Could you speak to that in terms of its impact on bond rating and what you're seeing from our other districts around the state?
Sure. David Arterberry with Stiefel Nicholas. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. As far as reserves go, that's probably one of the biggest single factors that impacts your rating, at least of those things that you can control. The other big thing being the economy in the area. So as far as the absolute levels of what the rating agencies are looking at, that's a little bit hard to say specifically, but typically what they like to see is something in the range when you look at balances in your capital outlay fund, balances in your special ed, and balances in your debt service. As an aggregate, they like to see those somewhere in the range of about 30 to 40% of your operating revenues. Now, that's, split up between those three different funds. So that's just sort of a ballpark number that they like to see. Most school districts that are rated in the AA or higher category have fund balances in those levels. School districts that are rated maybe a notch below that in the A category, they might have fund balances aggregate of about 20 to 30% of their operating revenues.
Okay, so in that number, you were including those reserves for special education during the switch in the school year and some other, okay.
Yeah, those
Yeah,
are the primary
not just
funds they look at.
Unallocated dollars, yep.
Yeah, those are the primary funds they look at is capital outlay, special education, and bond and interest.
Thank you.
Sure.
I'm not sure how other board members are feeling in terms of which option to go. Just, throwing something out there. I reached out to a number of constituents this weekend who I would consider to be pretty strong public school advocates, and most felt like option C is a more comfortable option for them because with the uncertainty of COVID and the economic uncertainty and just, the bumpiness that we've had with school, that they felt like option C would be the best place to land. That's just, again, some really preliminary feedback I've gotten from some people in the Northwest area. Not sure if anyone else reached out to others, but I think C would be a good, safe option that, we're respecting the situation that we're in with COVID. We're respecting this economic uncertainty that we could be facing in 2021. And so I think that might be a good place to land.
I think, Dr. Fulton, I don't know if you can go, if you're stuck in the slide again, or if you can go back to the one with the bond issues. I think there's a number of the criteria that we've kind of been talking about or thinking about in relation to the bond issue. Of all of those kind of criteria that seem to be relevant, C, all the information on each of those points to C. So data, I would add to that, Jamie, to people that you might have talked to at Northwest. I think that the level of community support in the scientific survey that was done with 500 of our community residents, when we look at all these other criteria, I would say that the information seems to be overwhelmingly pointing to option C.
I think option C does look good. I do know when you lose a building, that particular community will have the disappointment of not having their building included in the rebuilds on this go-round. And the benefit sometimes of having buildings included is that those families then really do the advocacy work in the community to inform everybody about the benefits of the bond and letting them know why it would be important to them. So there's the loss for moving away from having the 6 to just doing the 5. But I think in light of where we're at with everything, option C still gives you the 5 buildings, and it's not that we won't get to the others. We will. It just won't be in this go-round, or future boards will. I do like the idea of C also taking care of meeting the needs of our responsibilities now and not kicking the can down the road. Whereas with option A, I feel like that's kicking a can. We have the ability to do this. It's not. The community support was there for the lower amount, but it's not taking that risk of getting too close to where we might not get community approval and then might not be able to do anything as we potentially would face with option B.
And the risk is big.
Yeah,
and the
no,
risk
it's
is not being
close.
able to move forward on 5 of 7 starting next
Right.
year for our secondary staff.
Right. No, it's definitely a concern. Is there? Oh, Brad, sorry.
You go out and I'll go.
My comment would be that, based on what my previous question was or thought, that we have what we know, and then there's this chunk of stuff we just don't know. When I look at how we carve up $750 million to divide it over 3 years, A, does very little, a small amount in the first year, and then it gets much bigger second and third, whereas B is much bigger in the first chunk and then lesser. It's 350 than 200 essentially. I'm leaning towards C as well, simply because it evens them out. It gives us the ability to take care of the needs that are right in front of us with the $260 million, but equally allows us to be nimble as future boards to use the 250 to tackle those next. So that's the part that gives me the comfort in knowing that when this waters recede and we get to identify the needs that are out there, we haven't bit off too much in the front part, that it's equally spread out. So that's how I factor between A, B, and C.
Sarah? I would concur with Mr. Stratton. I think that, anytime, if I'm presented in my own personal life, a low estimate and a high estimate, I usually pick the middle one. So I think that having those amounts would be about the same for the next 3. And I think our last bond, correct me if I'm wrong, how much was the last bond? 226?
223 million.
223 million. So this is a similar amount, a little bit higher. And I just have one other question then. So Westwood View is in C and Belinda is out, correct? And so they were high. I'm assuming that they were the bigger need. Westwood View was the rated.
That is correct.
Okay, just wanted to double check on that. And I love the fact that you actually created a C after hearing the information that came back in the survey, and then created a C out of that information and had to tweak numbers here and there, but made it work, and we're still getting, a really robust list of items here, so improvements.
Can I clarify? It's not that Belinda is out, it's Belinda is deferred until the next bond.
Well, that's correct, but they
Thank you.
would not be included on this list, but then would be, I'm sure, probably at the top of the list for the next one. Go around, but yeah, that's maybe bad, sorry.
I understand what you were saying.
Sarah, you were on the board the last time that we approved a bond proposal. Was there any of this and then a future board will do X, Y, and Z? And if so, what did you think we would do?
Oh gosh, I don't remember that. No, I think that there's always things that obviously the list of things is way longer than this, and we need to, but I'm sure that these things came up at that point. I know they did. I can remember a few of them coming up, but you can only do so much at so time, so it's the highest needs things that get done, and then some things that always are there, like the HVAC, that just always come up every about 20 years. So I don't remember specifically, but again, it's just one of those balancing things where you see what you think the community has the will to do, and what our staff. This is going to be a lot of work, and I saw in B, I think it was going to be have to be bigger timelines because the amount of work that was going to be done in B. We have to think about that too, do we have the staff to be able to actually manage all of this? And we did such a fabulous job the last time with managing all that $223 million worth. But to answer your question, I don't remember basically what happened a couple days ago versus 5 years ago. But
I think it reinforces that all of the future stuff is sort of up for future folks to determine, and future superintendents, and like Mr. Robinson suggested, we'd probably relook at all of the buildings and assess where they are. So I wouldn't want someone who's a Belinda parent at home thinking, oh good, in 2026 my kid's going to have a brand new elementary school, because we can't make that commitment right now on behalf of a future board.
Well, until what Reverend Guy said, potentially something could happen to a building where all of a sudden it vaults to the top of the list. Something happens. Let's hope it doesn't, but in case it does, or some other need that's identified. So re-looking at that 3 years from now is a good idea.
Something that is, because this happens quite a bit in districts, and it may be a building, it may be something else in the district that people find for a long time, is usually once those get prioritized, especially when you're talking about a building that's older, that need is only going to increase between now and the next bond issue. So while you never want to make commitments that somebody else has to keep, just as with this list, there were folks that were on that didn't make the last list that did make it on this one. So as long as we're able to continue this pattern of behavior, I think are good. That he's going to be there and they continue to be at the top of the list, or you're at the top of the list.
Brad?
It's a fair statement to make.
And to build on that point of going back to look at the previous time, I want to loop back with what I remember it to be, but want to defer to anybody who clarify it. We used capital outlay and a bond at the same time. So we were able to do additional work with capital outlay that would not be into this. So even though we did 220, 230, there was another pretty good chunk of capital outlay that was done at the same time that allowed us to do this second list at the same time. And we won't have that this time, and I want to make that clear. So it was a two-part financing last time, and it'll be one-part financing this time. But please correct me if I've got that wrong.
No, that's correct. The board approved $85 million worth of capital outlay bonds, which those are paid off in 5 years. And we built the CAA out of that, finished up Shawnee Elementary, O&M facility. And I think we bought our first round of Apple devices out of the capital outlay fund at that time.
So, but correct me if I'm wrong too, Brookwood was actually built because we were able to do such a great job managing our bond money from the last time. We had enough left over. Am I correct on that?
That is correct. We had money in the bond to do some renovations, but not a rebuild. And we were able to save enough money on the other projects that we were able to rebuild that school.
There you go.
I also appreciate that we're having a conversation about how we want to prioritize the use of our capital outlay dollars, and especially the other kind of guardrail that we saw tonight was maybe capping 25% of our capital outlay dollars for custodials, but that rather than use those dollars to build another building, we're adding flexibility to our operational budget so we can adjust the workload of our secondary teachers. So I appreciate the explicit part of this conversation about how we're prioritizing dollars to meet the needs of our strategic plan and our community, especially now that we have a better sense of what the Gannon resolution is going to mean for us in terms of our operating costs into the next couple of years. So I appreciate that. Can we talk about timing a little bit of the bond? I'm not sure if that's something we need to discuss or not, but I feel like the bond plan was presented to us over a year ago, and given all that's happened since then, we've really been kind of deferring putting the bond out for on a ballot. And I think we discussed in the Finance and Facilities Committee, those folks were really talking about, they kind of were talking about the pros and cons, and were pretty consistently concerned about the thought of us putting this on the general election bond, because it really would have been just cluttered with so many other issues. And so I feel like the part of the, and the other piece is just the need to be transparent with our community about what it is we're trying to achieve with this bond, and adjusting the timing so that people have time to think about it. I know everyone's bandwidth is a little stretched right now, but and we have basically deferred this past the general election, and the soonest it would be is on a January mail-in ballot, correct?
It is, and we certainly listened to what the Finance Facilities Advisory Committee, I think they had a really robust discussion on that very issue, and it was interesting to hear their perspective, which was substantively to think about January over maybe November. But with, of course, everything that we've been working through with reopening school, we didn't have the bandwidth to deal with anything in November anyway. We do feel like we have the ability now to have the bandwidth to address information related to a bond issue. And Dr. Athan made this point, it's a really good one. As you know, the district can provide information about the bond issue. We cannot, by law, engage in any kind of position, yes, no, on the bond issue. But we can provide information, and it's important that we do so the voters have an accurate understanding of what they are actually voting on. And so we would be committed to making sure that happens to the very best of our ability. Of course, it'll look different maybe than in the past. In the past, you go out and you do community events and et cetera, et cetera. That's not going to probably be possible in this environment, but we'll find other strategies.
I guess two questions is, if it's not January, what is our next opportunity after that? And then a related question is just, how prepared are we for that education campaign? Because it does feel like end of January feels sort of right around the corner at this point. I know we're kind of bumping right up against our last chance to make a decision, and then getting information out when all of our typical tools are not available. Do we have that plan?
Yeah, to answer your first question, I believe March would be the next date that would become available. I want to check off here. Is that?
Gina, do you have that calendar?
I do, although I would say, and I might defer to Russell because I haven't had the direct conversations with the election commissioner. Typically, we work with the election commissioner in advance to make sure that we have a date that works, because there are all kinds of election laws, as you may know, that we need to make sure that we're complying with, including laws that don't allow overlapping with other elections that may be on the calendar. And so I am unsure as to what else the Johnson County Election Commissioner may have on the calendar in terms of the next available date after January, unless you've had some more.
I have not. We would have to go back to the election office to see what the next available date is after January.
And I threw that one date out only because that in theory, that might be the first date that's available. But it is problematic, because if somebody else is already on there, then you get bumped to the next available date, and that could be a ways off, actually. But January, we're in good shape for. So that was the answer to your first question. Your second question was?
Just around what our plans are for communicating out what a bond would be used for and how we do our part. I know we can't advocate for it explicitly, but how do we do our part to educate our community and partner with them?
Yeah, we absolutely are prepared to take the steps that we have to do internally to allocate resources, human resources, obviously, to make sure that we're getting information together, getting out to the community. A lot of it, obviously, is going to have to be digital. There might be other kinds of strategies that we can use as well. And that would be something that we could, once the board decides, if you were to go in January, then we could bring forward information to you so you get an idea of what those strategies would look like. In other words, we'd have a communication plan that we could bring forward and show you, so the community kind of knows what's happening and where they can get information and so on.
Jamie? And just a reminder for anyone who may be watching this at home or something, this is just a workshop, so we're not voting tonight. And so if people have strong opinions about which option you think, you at home would like to see us vote in favor of, feel free to email us, and we would certainly love to hear from our constituents. That vote will be at our next board meeting.
It's important as a matter of technicality to kind of get a sense of where the board might be tonight, because you do have to prepare that bond resolution. The bond resolution has to be complete with the date and the amount and so on, so that we have it ready for you as a board to actually vote on it.
Can we interpret our community survey as kind of answering that question? Are you thinking that's a different? I'm just thinking we have 500 people sampled randomly from across each of the high school areas that have given us information about what people think.
Yeah,
about.
I just wanted to remind people we're not voting tonight, number one.
Gotcha.
It's a workshop. And then number two, if someone feels strongly, let us know,
Sure.
because it's important that everybody's voice is heard and considered. Those are my 2 points.
Okay. Can you remind me, there were some bonds, you kind of made reference to some other bonds in the area. I think Lawrence recently passed a bond, Lee Summit. What were their mill levy, were they tax increase bonds, either of those? And Do you know what the
I
amount?
can't speak for Lee Summit, because I work primarily on the Kansas side.
Okay.
Lawrence Schools, they did have an election, and I think it was for 75 million, is that right, Gina?
Somewhere around 75 now.
Yeah, and their issue, they were able to do that, I'm trying to recall, it was either no mill increase or a very small one. And when I say very small, I'm talking about a level probably at your option A level, not your option C. Only, a few mills as opposed to a larger mill like Ken was saying that can be, in the hundreds of dollars.
Okay.
You mean between B and C?
Yeah, B and C.
A is the
sorry, B and C,
zero
B and C,
zero
yeah,
tax
yeah.
increase,
Okay.
so
So
between
more
B
like
and
C.
So more
Okay.
like C.
Somewhere between B and C, probably closer to B.
B is the,
B is the big
Big
one, so
one.
you're
Right.
saying probably closer to C.
C.
Yeah.
Okay.
okay.
Does anyone in the room have history on our bonds? I've always been told that our bonds have passed.
I have some history.
Oh, thank you. I'd love to hear that.
So in 2015 was our first mail ballot. That passed 80.2%. 31.7% participated in the voting. And then the next one prior to that was 2004. That was April elections, when we still had April elections. 68.2% voted in favor of that bond, with only 17.7% turnout. And before that, that was the 1990s, and I couldn't find any information on that.
It passed because I think we did the work.
Yes, we did. That's when we did a lot of
Windows or something on my son's elementary school at that point.
we did a ton of air conditioning work in the 90s.
Oh, that is when South got air conditioning. I remember it.
The other thing I'd point out on, because I know such a big part of this bond is about teacher workload reductions, but there's a tiny asterisk that is really important that talks about stable state finance being a piece of our ability to achieve secondary workload reductions, right? Can you, I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that this is multiple puzzle pieces coming together. This is capital outlay, putting some guardrails up around custodial salaries. This is a bond package, and this is state funding. So can you talk about that a little bit?
I'll be happy to. In fact, I'm going to turn that over to Russ, because that is a very important assumption, that we will continue to get the funding that the state says that we're going to receive.
Yeah, and as you're aware, we're, by statute, they're locked into paying the increase in the base aid per pupil amount. And so we have 2 more years after this with the built-in increases, and then we jump to the consumer price index. If there were going to be any changes to the base, they would happen in the spring legislative session that is coming up. So can't look into my crystal ball and tell you if they're going to waver from that. The revenue numbers from the state of Kansas that have come out so far through September have surpassed their revised estimates that they did back in April. They revised the estimates based on the pandemic, and so far those revenues are exceeding those estimates. And then they'll come back in November and do another consensus revenue estimate for the legislators in the spring, in theory, to work their budget for the next year.
And all of that depends on our full-time FTE, not meaning full-time employees, but full-time enrollment. Essentially bouncing back from
Our weighted
this-
FTE.
Our weighted FTE. If it were to stay at what it's at right now, where we've lost 1,400 students, then that state funding might not be adequate. I just want to make sure. I'm very worried about the enrollment loss we've had.
But it's based on an average over a couple of years, so
2
we
years,
won't
but
get the
if we,
hit.
I mean, these are pre-K and kindergarten mostly that we've lost. If they don't come back, if they decide the school they started kindergarten at is their forever school, we do potentially get less state funding just based on lower enrollment.
Yeah, and Russ, you can respond to it. Remember, too, as you're going through that, you're also adjusting your expenses on the FTE side, which
Yeah.
we've already been doing. So there's adjustments that you
Okay,
make.
thank you for that.
As long as you make those, and you're going to keep yourself in much better position. Russ, do you want to
Okay,
respond
thank
to
you.
that?
Yeah, so if you recall, the largest part of our weighted enrollment school finance formula is the head count. And the law says you take the higher of the 2 prior years. You don't even use your current year. So we would be operating most likely on 18-19. Then next year would be on 19-20. And then I think we're in year 22-23. Then it'll be between this year that we're in currently and next year. So to your point, we would love to see a rebound for next year because that will weigh in the 22-23 school
Okay,
year.
I had the timing mixed up, so thank you.
Yeah.
Dr. Sinclair, I did look on the source of all knowledge and the phone.
Thank you. Thank you.
They had, Lawrence Schools had an $87 million bond election, and their tax rate increase was $27 per 100,000 of assessed value.
Oh, so that is
property
more
value.
than the 8.
Okay, thank you.
And I know, Brad, yeah, I would love to hear from you, but I want to touch base with Reverend Guy and with Jessica too, because I know now we've all issued a preference or at least a comfort level with option C. And so I kind of want to touch base with the other two to see where they're at.
Yes, I'm very comfortable with option C.
Okay, great. Jessica, do you have a?
Yeah, I mean, I'm comfortable with option C. I think the public would maybe even support option B, but given COVID, I'm not as comfortable with it.
Okay, great.
Just to piggyback on this conversation about state funding, I want to remind all of us by turning to those that really know it well. In the state of Kansas, there is a criteria and a formula where some districts that issue bonds are then able to receive a subsidy compensation from the state. We do not qualify for that. I just want to make sure I'm saying that right, because sometimes the voting public gets a little confused when an adjacent district puts out a bond and then they get a state match. And could you speak to that?
Yeah, Russ, go ahead.
It's called the Bond and Interest State Aid. It's based on assessed valuation per pupil, and we have never qualified for that. If we ever were to qualify for it, then something's terribly going wrong here in Johnson County. There's a big gap between where we're at and then the next school district that actually gets it. I will be doing the application for bond and interest state aid just in case, but more likely we will not be eligible for that aid.
Thanks for clarifying that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, are we comfortable with where we're at? Are there any additional questions or thoughts we want to get from the experts while they're here in the room? Or are we ready to move on to our next item for discussion this evening? Kind of get a nods, shakes heads, dirty looks. Okay, good. All right, well, thank you very much, all of you who were in attendance tonight to help us work through this. It's appreciated.
Thank you.
Could we take a very brief break to transition for the
Absolutely.
next group? Okay,
5 minutes?
that's more than enough,
Okay, excellent. 5 minutes.
just to stand.
Okay, looks like everybody's here. So we will move on to item 3.2, the reopening schools update. And so I will turn it over to Dr. Fulton to lead that discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. Tonight, we actually have the major part of tonight is actually doing a walkthrough of the revised Johnson County gating criteria. But in the course of reviewing that, we'll also have an opportunity to do a little compare and contrast with how Johnson County's criteria compares to some other gating criteria that are out there as well, whether it's from the state or from a regional entity. So we'll talk about that a little bit tonight. And then we'll answer questions or just have a conversation around those gating criteria. And then when we're done with that part, we've just got a very brief update on elementary and secondary for you. So I'm going to start off where we always begin, and that's with our mission statement. We did that with the earlier presentation, but it is a good reminder that amidst the challenge of COVID-19, which I think, as we all recognize, could be with us for some time, we really have to stay diligent about staying focused on our mission and doing the very best job that we can in what has become a very changed learning environment to meet the needs of our children. That's both academic, social, emotional, But it's also a great opportunity to innovate and to find new ways of doing things. Of course, whenever you innovate and find new ways of doing things, it's never a linear path. There's a lot of growth curve in that, and we're all experiencing that right now. Whether it's as teachers, as administrators, parents, students. We heard that tonight from some of the speakers. So we'll just keep working together at it and just trying to get better, try to keep getting better every day. But for the moment, what we want to do is give you a little bit of an update on that gaining criteria. And we're so pleased to have Elizabeth Holshu with us tonight. She is quite a rock for us in terms of these community-wide conversations around community health, and specifically working with Shawnee Mission and the other Johnson County school districts, and trying to find ways to work safely in the midst of this global pandemic. So we thank you for being here, and at this point I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Dr. Fulton, and thank you, board members, for having me here. As Dr. Fulton said, I'm Elizabeth Holshu. I'm the Director of Epidemiology at the Johnson County Department of Health and Environment, and have been working very closely with Dr. Fulton and Shelby. Shelby and I have been working very closely for 5 years at least now since I came to Johnson County. So I appreciate the opportunity to both present to you sort of how we got to where we are, some of the changes that you have seen in the last week or two, and then I'm also happy to answer questions at the end. You got me? Okay, you got me. All right. So just a quick couple statements about how we got here. I actually think it was Shelby who came to me first, maybe in July, and said, look, we need gating criteria. We need some kind of metric to help us decide what is safe and what is not safe in terms of bringing kids back into schools. How do we do this to optimize the health of our students, our staff, both in terms of COVID as well as on the whole? And so we started looking around and really could not find a whole lot that had been produced at that point, not federally or locally. So we started digging into what did exist. So we looked at the White House gating criteria when we were talking about reopening our communities. We looked at the WHO and what they had set out as different standards. And we started looking at the science and what did it tell us? What did it tell us about transmission potential within kids? What did it tell us about the optimal spacing, and how could we potentially bring kids back in a safe manner? And so really the way we approached this was you sort of have two buckets, right? You have COVID-19 prevention. And if we were to do COVID-19 prevention, if that was the only thing we cared about, we would all be staying at home, no kids would be learning. But we know that that's not the only part of this equation. We also know that there's the mental health of students and staff. There's the economic stability of these families if they can't work. There's the stability of being in a classroom and having those trusted teachers and staff members. And so we sort of looked at all of this as a big giant picture and said, how can we set out guidance and help kids come back to school, but make it so it's safe, both for them to be in classrooms, for their families that they go home to at night, as well as for our staff, some of whom may have high-risk comorbidities that may put them at additional risk for severe illness. And so that's where we began. And so we basically put out our initial iteration, and that was after a lot of consultation with both the superintendents of the 6 school districts, as well as our health service coordinators, a lot of back and forth and a lot of sort of developing this. And so we came out with our initial version, which we've now updated. And after we released that initial guidance, we started seeing more gating criteria come out. So we were really the first who stepped out and said, this is what we think. And I will fully admit it was not perfect. Gating criteria is not something that we have done particularly at a local level, but even as a national, public health system, setting out gating criteria and putting things into nice, neat buckets for when we can say this is safe and this is not safe is a very difficult thing because A, the science is limited at this point. When we were doing that, we were only about 4 months in from our very first case and only 6 months in or so from the very first case ever recognized. So the science was really lacking, and there just aren't neat buckets. And there wasn't a lot of guidance as to what those cut points should be. So I think what we came out with was a good first step, and what I've been really encouraged by is to see the other entities who've taken that, who've evaluated it, who've actually brought together more stakeholders than we were able to at the local level, and have it continue to develop and come out with additional guidance. And I think that it's been a really strong point of Kansas in general and Mark is that while we all have different gating criteria, which I know drives people crazy, I think that each step has been an iteration that we've learned upon what we've already done. So what I'd like to do is first start with KSDE and KDHE's gating criteria. So this has 5 different metrics that they are looking at. The first is building gating criteria. So what does absenteeism look like in your schools? There's also the community gating criteria, which is going to be based on incidence rate. There's also the percent positive, and I'm sorry, I cannot actually see that. So, and poor Shelby's like, oh, do you want it? I was like, no, it's fine. I don't need it in front of me. Thank you. So this way I at least know the order. So, so there's the percent positive, which we'll talk a little bit more about. There's the incidence rate, so that's the number of cases, and that's just normalized to a population. So what that means is we can look at our incidence rate, we can look at how many cases per 100,000 population in Johnson County, and we can compare that to Wyandotte County based on theirs normalized to the population. We also have, KSDE also looks at the trend, so whether it's increasing, decreasing, or stable, and then also the hospital capacity, which I'll talk a little bit more about as well. So the next one is the MARC gating criteria, which looks pretty similar. And so, again, you have similar things like the incidence rate, you have percent positive on there, you have the trends. They also included these 5 components that CDC has put out, and these are key parts to being able to mitigate coronavirus transmission in your schools. And these are all things that you guys have been taking very seriously and been implementing. It's about distancing, it's about masking, it's about all of these pieces. And then they also include absenteeism. So this is our most recent one, and it looks a little different in that we are now looking at the incidence rate. So again, the number of cases over 2 weeks, normalized to a population, and that percent positive. And this is based on our new calculation of percent positive. And then we also have some modifying variables, and these are sort of those mitigation efforts, things that can be done both in the schools, the participation or the holding of extra and co-curricular activities. As we've seen since we've opened schools, that is our primary source of transmission risk across all of our school districts. We are having very good luck with our mitigation efforts that have been put in place in the schools, in classrooms to not see spread, but our sports and our extracurriculars, that is where we're seeing a lot of transmission, a lot of exposure. And then also about public health capacity, because if the number of cases overwhelm the public health department's ability to keep up with cases, that means if we're not being able to call people shortly after they're positives, make sure they're staying home, identify their contacts, make sure they're staying home, then we start losing our ability to control the spread of the virus. If we can't reach out to contacts and tell them they've been exposed, then the likelihood is they will then be out in the community and potentially expose somebody else. And then it just sort of spirals from there, because we know with COVID, one person on average can infect 2 people, those 2 people can infect 2 more, those can each infect 2 more, and so it just sort of keeps growing at an exponential rate. And that's what public health's role is to try and stop what we call transmission chains. So identify where somebody has been exposed, get them to stay home, and prevent them from going and potentially infecting somebody else. So all of these are really important. So commonalities are the number of new cases, so particularly that incidence rate, but you will see that our numbers vary. We actually, so our top range, our red zone where we're in full remote across the board is actually 251 cases per 100,000 people over 2 weeks. And so the way we get this number is you add up all of your cases over 2 weeks, you divide by our population, and you multiply by 100,000. And the reason why we did that was looking at our cases. If we were to go with what KSDE's guidance is, which is, I believe, more than 150 cases over 2 weeks per 100,000, we're not going to get there anytime soon, I'm afraid. We have been up over 200 pretty regularly for quite a while, for I'd say probably 2 months. And that's with our mask mandate, where we sort of saw a leveling off of our cases. Had we not put the mask mandate in place and we continued to have the same exponential growth we were having at that time, our case counts would be even higher, and there's no way that public health would be able to keep up. So we did do some sort of cushioning, because we recognize that part of the conversation about that incidence rate is what can public health handle? What is public health's capacity? And we've been able to build our capacity to do the work. Percent positives, there's different definitions. So KDHE and MARC, who actually define how they want that calculated for each of their metrics, they're actually defined differently. And the next slide, I'll talk about how those different calculations look. And then trends. So you've seen this in both our original gating criteria as well as KSDE's and Mark's, and it's that increasing, decreasing, stable. I think my word of caution is that nobody ever defines how to calculate that. So like KDHE's increasing or decreasing on their website, I believe, is an increase of 1 case per 100,000 people from 1 week to the next. In Johnson County, that's like, I don't know, 8 cases a week or something. So it's a pretty small number. And so that can cause a lot of fluctuation. And so as people have either developed their own gating criteria, and some lessons we learned is how you define each of these is really important for having a very data-driven, as limited bias as possible approach to figuring out what is safe and what is not. So I know that other things to keep in mind, hospital capacity, so I know that's on both of them. Hospital capacity is really a lagging indicator, as we call it. So if we're looking to see whether or not hospital capacity is high, so if we're starting to run out of beds, the reality is because of the way COVID is transmitted and how long it takes to develop symptoms, all of those infections, as we're starting to see a spike in hospitalizations, all those infections occurred a week to 2 weeks ago. So by the time we start getting concerned about our hospital capacity, we have lost the ability to really do anything about them because all those people have already been infected. And so when we're looking at cases, that's going to be one of our first indicators. How many people are getting tested and testing positive? And then about a week to 2 weeks after that, you'll start seeing those hospital cases increase. And so while I think that it's something good to look at, I know Children's Mercy has been a little hesitant to lean on this because all of the hospital capacity data in the metro that Mark presents does not actually include children's hospitalizations or ICU beds. So that's also a limitation of it. And then, what Shelby and I were talking about was the thing about our hospital capacity that's really great here in Johnson County in the KC Metro is there's plenty of options, right? We have a lot of different hospital systems. But the problem is if we start seeing cases spiking in rural Kansas down in Southeast, and they start losing their hospital capacity because those individuals are far more likely to be older, have more comorbidities, and less likely to have access to routine health care, the likelihood that they have more severe symptoms is probably higher than some of our residents. And so if they start overwhelming their limited hospital capacity, that then gets pushed to our system as well. And so we definitely don't live in a vacuum where all we have to worry about is who's here in our metro and how our hospitals are doing as well. School absenteeism, I think, is a really great metric, but is very dependent on how you define it. And I'm sure that Shawnee Mission and Shelby have come up with a way that they are going to calculate whether you're including people who are quarantined. So not necessarily sick, but they're not in school learning. And so I think that it's fine no matter if people are including that. And I think it's very important to look at, but it's very dependent. So if, for instance, if DeSoto is reporting their absenteeism numbers, it may look very different than what Shawnee Mission's reporting just because of how they're counting who's actually absent. And finally, staffing capacity. I've heard a lot of conversations about this being included in gating criteria around the county. I think, what we've heard from some superintendents is like, no, we don't need to measure that. We'll know. We'll know when this is not going well for us. But from what I've already heard, staffing capacity is the biggest problem that school districts are going to run into. We know that people are getting exposed in the community and then are having to be out in quarantine or getting sick. And then finding subs is becoming a very difficult problem, as I'm sure you all are aware of, and at least from what we're hearing from other schools. So percent positivity, the thing that everybody likes to ask about, because it's a lot about it. We do calculate it different than KDHE. Even our new version is calculated differently. And I think what's really interesting about this is that percent positive was not really a metric we used a whole lot in communicable disease epidemiology prior to COVID. It just wasn't, for very few of our diseases did we actually look at that. And so when this started becoming a thing with COVID, there wasn't really any standard as to how we calculate it. It was like percent positive. So we sort of had to step out on our own and figure that out. And so when we were getting ready to push out our first dashboard, we consulted with all of the regional health departments, all of my EPIs at all the different health departments, and we all came up with the way we were going to calculate it. But what we've learned through hard lessons is that what made sense in month 1 or 2 of the pandemic doesn't necessarily make sense in month 6 or 7. And so this is the percent positive change is part of that learning. So what you can see, and the details aren't really all that important on that graph, is you can see how divergent those three lines are. Those are three different ways to calculate the percent positives. And I will tell you that the original version of this graph, I think, had 6 different versions on it, because the way you think about data and the way you count it can change everything. And so I'm just going to talk through the 3 different ways that we do this. So Johnson County's previous method. So what you have is the formula, right? It's a math formula. Across our previous method, our new method, and KDHE's method, the top, the numerator is all the same. It's the number of new positive cases. The bottom is what changes, and as this denominator changes, obviously your percent positive changes. So our previous method was, in the denominator, were individuals who were newly tested. And so what this meant was that if I got tested in May, during the early part of the pandemic, and then I got tested again in August, I would only be counted that first time. And that's how we set it out in month 1 of the pandemic, because testing wasn't very available. And so if you were getting tested multiple times, it usually meant because you were in the hospital and somebody thought that you actually were positive and the test wasn't very good. So we were like, we'll just count the very first negative, that somebody has. And that's what all of the regional health departments had decided to move forward doing. We were all in agreement. Well, we started evaluating our data once KDHE produced theirs, and we saw how different our data were, and we started digging in. And what we realized, and you can see this on our new dashboard, is we have a tremendous number of individuals in our community who are tested multiple times. There are some days where of the, 1,500, 2,000 people who are getting tested in Johnson County, half of them are repeat tests. So when you have that many people who are repeat tested, that starts skewing that bottom number, that denominator, which is why that old percent positive was higher, because our denominator was smaller. We were only counting the newly tested individuals. So the way we're now doing it, our new method is, it's essentially, as CDC calls it, people over people. It's the number of new positives over the number of individuals tested. And I think that this is probably I don't think it's a perfect way, and I'll explain a little bit why. I think it's more accurate. So people over people makes sense to me, at least. The way KDHE does it is they do people over tests. So it's the number of new positives over all of the tests that are performed over that time frame. So even if you get tested multiple times, you're going to be counted multiple times. So I want to walk through a couple of examples to show you how this sort of changes. So this is the first example that I sort of already talked through. So Mary tested positive in June, tested negative in June and tested negative in September. So in our old way, Mary would only be tested in June. She would not be counted in September because we're counting that first negative test. In our new method, Mary would actually be counted in both for that 14-day trend, right? So what we're showing, we're not even showing cumulative anymore. It's just that 14 days. So we're looking at 14-day snapshots, one after another. In KDHE's method, it would be the same as JCDHE's new method, right? Mary's counted in both. So in our second scenario, though, John actually gets tested every day, which happens in Johnson County because we have residents who are parts, for instance, of professional sports teams. And so some of those testing protocols in the NFL or the MLS, or MLB, they're getting tested every single day as part of that protocol. And so this is the case for John. So from August 1st onwards, he is tested every day. So in our old method, we would have counted John just that first time on August 1st and then sort of pretended he didn't exist moving forward. So this is where it gets a little complicated. So because we produce 14-day trends, right? So that over the last 14 days, what percent positive of our tests? So we're going to count John one time in that denominator now because he is one individual. Even though he's been tested 14 times the last 14 days, he's going to get counted one time. And so each time that 14-day trend moves, it's completely the number of new positives over number of individuals tested. So the way that KDHE's method is different, though, is that KDHE would count John 14 times in that denominator. So when you're counting people so many times in that denominator, it makes that denominator bigger, which drives your percent positive down. And so that's why you'll see this sort of variation in the way, in what level that percent positive is. Our new method is somewhere in between. It's much closer to KDHE's method. Do I think it's perfect? No, because from August 1st until now, for every 14-day time point that we measure, so for the last 2 months, we would count John as a single individual in each one of those calculations, just as a single individual, but he gets moved sort of from each day to each day. And so I think that, percent positive is not perfect, but it can tell us some interesting things. It talks both about what the pandemic looks like in our community in terms of the cases, that number of new positives, but it also talks too about what our testing capacity is. And so it's not a perfect measure because, if testing capacity goes up and your positives go up, then your percent positive may sort of stay stagnant, right? Because both numerator and denominator are increasing. But for instance, if your number of positives stays the same, but your total tests go down, so you're having less people in your community tested, you're actually going to see that spike. You're going to see your percent positive go up because your denominator is lower. So there's a lot of nuance into it, and like I said, can be looked at multiple different ways. I think what we're at is probably the most accurate version. It's what Johns Hopkins would recommend calculating it as. I still don't think it's perfect, but it is something for us to look at. And so I think that the new way is a more accurate version to some degree. But I think that because of the nuance and because it can really be impacted by people's decisions in our community, so you may be aware that there are parents on some Facebook groups who are talking about, when we're getting ready to reopen schools, everybody go get tested so we can decrease our percent positive, right? Or potentially as families maybe don't get tested because they don't want the ramifications. You're going to see that number fluctuate. And so it can be impacted by community decisions. The number of cases can also be impacted by community decisions if people don't get tested. But it's a little bit more stable, it's a little bit more comparative. So we're definitely looking at the incidence rates, the number of new cases over the last 2 weeks per 100,000 is sort of the primary indicator for our gating criteria, but still looking at percent positive, still looking at the trend as part of that decision-making process. So you guys probably just learned way more about percent positivity than you ever would have liked to know. Me too. So we relaunched our new dashboard last week, and this was after getting a lot of feedback from the community, learning a lot from our first dashboard launch 6 months ago about we have just more information about our methodology, more comparisons, and again, things are different now. In the beginning, we cared. We were counting every case or every 10 cases, and when we got to 20, and when we got to 50, and when we got to 100, now we eclipse 1,000 cases every week or so, and so we're in a different phase. So we hope that the new dashboard reflects that, and as part of that is our school gating criteria with these two numbers on there, as well as the current recommended phase. You'll see in orange. Before we only had green, yellow, red. We tried to align that with the state. So that is the end of my presentation. I am happy to answer any questions that anybody has.
Okay, so we'll go around the table for this one. I'll start with Ms. Borgman, if that's okay with you, Jamie.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ms. Holshow. I really appreciate your presentation, and it was really interesting to hear the historical perspective and the evolution. So thanks for taking that time to go through that with us, and for being here tonight. So you're right. We're stuck on this percent positivity, right? Like we're all sort of these armchair epidemiologists, right? Where we're all like hyper-focused on the percent positivity. So if I look at the dashboard today, we're at this 5.8%, which shows that we would be in the yellow, close to green, but the incident rate really is the gatekeeper for all of it. So I'm still kind of trying to understand, there's so much that just really rests in that incident rate. Why even include the positivity rate if it really is all about the incident rate?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. I think it's a couple-fold. One is obviously our very first grading criteria had that percent positive. We revamped the way we were doing the percent positive. I think to some degree the optics, if we were just to drop it altogether when we altered our calculation, there's not great optics there. So it's sort of like, just kidding, guys, we didn't, right? So that's not our goal. I do think it can tell us an important piece, but it's also in the context of all the other pieces that are being shown to us. And so I think that this has never been about one thing, although it may have appeared that way. I think that it's about taking all of these different pieces of information. I think the trend is really important. So even if you had looked at, on that graph where I had the three, the way we were presenting it was sort of up a little, was certainly higher, but the trends were generally the same over time. And so I think it's about how all of these tell the story of where we are as a county, as a community in terms of COVID prevention. I personally feel that because of the population that we serve in Johnson County, we have individuals of a higher socioeconomic status in general in our community who have more access to health care. I think we're also seeing a lot of negative tests and repeat tests for people who are seeking health care and procedures. We know that people who are going to the hospital for whatever that may be are getting tested sometimes multiple times. And so I do think that that percent positive is probably even lower than it would be in a similar, if we were in Wyandotte and had the same kind of cases, I think it's probably lower. But I still think it tells us important things in conjunction with looking at how many tests are we doing and what is that incidence rate. So while not the only metric, I think it's worth being part of the conversation when we think about what the data are telling us about transmission in Johnson County.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you for being here. I know you've been talking with all of the superintendents of the Johnson County school districts, and this district has been the most conservative in Johnson County with getting students back into the buildings. And I've appreciated that personally because I feel like that gives us more opportunities to gather more information. So I'm just curious, broad overview in Johnson County, how is it going with students back in the buildings compared to what your expectations were, I guess?
Oh, really excellent questions. So I think we've had a lot of lessons learned so far, and Shelby and I were talking before we came in, and I think that they've had that opportunity, the extra time you guys have had, to see what some of the other districts are doing, but also forge your own way with being very thoughtful about implementation. So one of these big pieces is contact tracing within the schools, or identifying the contacts of individuals who are infected, who are positive for COVID. And what we have seen across the six districts, is that contact tracing is what is really is stressing and straining our school districts. And so having a very thoughtful approach, because it's not just identifying the contacts. There's a lot of data management that comes into that. There's a lot of follow-up. There's a lot of outreach. There's a lot of communication with families and parents and the health department. It is overwhelming how much is now being asked of people who already had too much being asked of them in the first place. And so I think that Shelby and leadership here has been very thoughtful about how to arrange that. So I think that they have probably one of the better systems in terms of being able to have this sustainable, because I think that we all need to have an idea that this has to be sustainable. We're going to be in this for a while. I am very relieved, I guess is probably the best word, that we have not really seen transmission in schools when we talk about classrooms and positives. And so our quarantine recommendations do seem to be working. Those are only as good as people telling the truth, unfortunately. But so far, we've had very good luck, which means that the masking and the distancing and the cohorting has gone exceptionally well. Sports continue to be the biggest driver of transmission and of cases and quarantines across the board. So lots of lessons about that. I think that there's still a lot to be seen, though. So we have one school district who's been in hybrid for their secondary schools, and so far we've been okay. We have another district who's going to be going in full in-person in their secondary schools, and quite frankly, I have a lot of anxiety about that because you have a lot of kids and a lot of movement. But, we'll just take each step and try and do what we can. But I think the contact tracing, the ability to do that and to continue to do it and to do it at a high level is what is necessary for schools to be able to continue to stay open. Because if you can't identify contacts, you can't get them out of school while they're potentially infectious, you just have transmission going. And then those individuals bring it back to their homes or bring it to their staff, and it just, like I said, keeps spreading from there. So I think with the time you guys have taken, it's been really great, at least from some of the work that we've done in terms of developing a contact tracing plan and having staff in place for that. So.
My question's about testing and the availability, the capacity, and the turnaround time, and how that's evolved to this point to affect the positive rate, but then also what you envision it's going to look like as the technology and science continues to improve. What's that data set going to look like as we presumably have even more data?
Those are really excellent questions. So testing has definitely been an evolution over the last 6 months, as I'm sure everybody, at least big picture, understands, right? From the time where there were no tests and we could only test people who were from China, to now where we have, I believe, we have several hundred spots available at the health department every day for testing. And there was also a backlog, I want to say middle of July, but there's a pandemic time warp that occurs in our office, so it could be some other time, Where we were having 5, 7, 10-day turnaround times, that is gone now, which is a huge relief. We are, from our office, and we send out to a couple of different labs, we're seeing turnaround times 24, 48, maybe 72 hours at the outset for our labs, and we're seeing that across the board, which is really critical for that public health intervention. You need to get those positive test results so we can start quarantining and isolating people. The new advent of testing has been a challenge, I'll say, to some degree. I think that it's great that we have rapid testing opportunities. Oak Park Mall, for instance, is now pushing through a lot. We're seeing a lot of results from there. But those rapid tests aren't as reliable as our PCR tests. So I know that Shelby's nurses can say, I got a message from one of them who was like, in one day alone, I had 6 people who went and got rapid tests at Oak Park, were negative, and they got PCR tests done, because that's our recommendation if they're symptomatic, and they came back positive. So sometimes those rapid tests aren't great, and so if people are only relying on those, that may mean that there's spread. So it's not great necessarily early in their symptoms, like right in that pre-symptomatic phase, and then certainly if you're asymptomatic, it's not great, and sometimes even if you're symptomatic, we still get negatives. So having that ability to go and get that PCR testing when we really are suspecting, so that's what we do is PCR testing, I think is really critical, and I'm really excited about the partnerships between the health department and the school. So now, anytime somebody is getting sent home from school, staff or student, because they are feeling ill, they get a card and they can drive straight to our health department as long as during our hours. They don't need an appointment, and they can get tested right there. And then we also know what school they're from. So when that comes back, we're able to immediately turn around and feed back to the school nurse if it's positive. And so I think with the rapid tests, that's always going to be the question: is how do we integrate some of these the Abbott tests, or and some of the stuff that we've heard maybe coming down to schools. How do we integrate that in the best way possible, while still having data that we can trust? Still recognizing that when we get a test result, we know what to do with it, whether it's somebody who's symptomatic and negative, and we need to send them over for a more advanced test anyway.
I would just add to that in addition to what Elizabeth described, the fast pass cards that we can send people to the county, and they don't have to have an appointment, they go straight to the front of the line. We are also working with the state and with the county for saliva testing, and I happen to have one here that I was just learning how to use when we were sitting out there waiting. But these will start to be available probably next week to anyone who is symptomatic, staff or student in one of our school buildings. If they don't have a primary care doctor to see, or they can't drive all the way out to Olathe, maybe it's a transportation issue or a gas money issue, our nurses will be able to test them right in the school. It's still the 24 to 72 hour turnaround rate.
Yeah, it is a PCR test, so.
Thank you.
Can I ask a few more questions about testing capacity? So the county authorized in the last couple of weeks, had authored some increase in resources towards testing capacity, and the SPARK committee at the state level also authorized some funds for increased testing capacity. So some of that included, I'm assuming that's that Abbott rapid test there, or is that something different? So are we going to be getting additional resources, or is there a need for additional resources? So maybe something like that could be used not just for those folks without transportation, but where we might have suspicion of cases, and you could, do a whole classroom or something like that.
Yeah, so those are not the Abbott tests. Those are, so the Abbotts are what the White House has been using, right? So it's a portable machine, and it takes about 15 minutes, and they're very quick. They're the rapid tests that are based on antigens. So also what Oak Park is doing. The saliva kits that Shelby was referencing are PCR, so those are courtesy of for this set at least, is from Johnson County funding through CARES Act. So the intention behind it is a couple of fold. One is sort of that identification of the ill individuals, the ones that we need to get a positive or negative test result so that they can either be in school or we can quarantine whoever we need to. There's a second layer on that we're still trying to work through logistics, because it may be a heavy lift, or it will be a heavy lift in its current model. And that goes to your point of testing an entire classroom. So right now we are only quarantining individuals who were unmasked and in close contact with a positive individual, and this is different than what the state recommends. And so one of the conversations we've had is if there's a positive in a classroom, what we could do is then go in and offer saliva testing to all the individuals that we would consider to be low risk. So in contact, but with a mask on, and make sure that we're not having any unidentified transmission in that population. So I'm really excited about that opportunity so that we can hopefully identify people who maybe are asymptomatic and can stop those transmission chains. But it does take a lot of work, as you can imagine. It can't be done in a classroom because you can't have 15 kids spitting into a cup because that would be an exposure if any of them do come back positive. And it's also a very heavy lift for the nurses if they're to pull everybody out. So trying to work through how that would look.
So now it's a question of logistics, not capacity. We have that testing capacity in the state of Kansas for our schools?
So there's a little bit more to just the capacity. I mean, Johnson County plus the state could probably supply us with all the saliva testing that we needed, but it's a matter of staffing capacity. So, I mean, imagine if this were a football team with 42 members, like we quarantined today, 42 members of a football team, and if we were trying to bring all of them back at, day 10, something like that, to test them all. That is what Elizabeth is referring to as the heavy lift. You know, for me to free up a nurse to test 42 individuals while she still has kids in her building that have seizure disorders, trach, PICC lines, caths, you know, she needs to be providing nursing care and also to do this testing. So that's the logistics we're still trying to figure out.
But as for actual testing kits, we are finalizing our contracts now, and we will have that in place very shortly. So we've already gotten some to all of the school districts, but more are coming, definitely.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So on the incident rate versus the percent positivity rate, if I'm reading the new gating criteria accurately, if we hit 251 then for incident rate, does that mean that we then move into red on our own without the percent positivity, or do we not go in until we have both?
Yeah, so it is not we're not looking at this as you're only as good as your worst indicator, which is sort of that idea, right? So if our number of cases goes up into the red, we're shutting everything down. I don't think that is not what we're saying with the gating criteria. I think that part of the idea around this revamp is not only adding additional metrics, but also adding in those other factors, those modifying variables. So if we still have public health capacity, that's not as big of a deal if we start seeing an increase in cases in terms of capacity. And if our hospital beds are still okay, that means we can probably keep going. But again, for me, a lot of this is about what we're seeing in schools. As the number of cases increase in our community, that invariably means that we're going to have more cases introduced into schools, just because of the law of numbers. But if we're continuing to do all the things, if the school districts are doing all the things they've put in place, if they're continuing to be able to contact trace, if the spacing and the masking and all of that's going well, and we're not seeing continued spread, and we're still seeing some low-ish percent positives, and we have all these other modifying variables, then I think in general we are comfortable with continuing to stay open as long as these pieces are continuing. So again, even though it's gating criteria, and I think this is one of the lessons we learned, is to the point I made earlier, it's hard to put things in nice, neat buckets, especially as we keep learning things every week and every month as schools are open. So if we were to hit 251, we are not saying that schools are shut down immediately and we're going full remote. That is not at all the intention.
Well, and then the flip side to that is that we could end up in a situation where we have significantly higher rates of community spread, but the buildings are remaining open. There isn't a hard stop to say, okay, we have infection rates that are significantly high. And then I have one more follow-up question on the percent positivity rate, just for clarification with regards to, Wyandotte County has some fairly high positivity rates, and KC-Mo has some fairly high positivity rates. But we are not using the same percent positivity methodology as those two counties. And so now it is somewhat interesting to say, okay, well, where are we in relation to our geographic neighbors, with spread happening over the county line and state line, because the virus doesn't care about that. So what methodology are Wyandotte County and KC-Mo using? Is it the one you were using previously? Is it something different? So that if we're looking at that and saying, okay, well, it is high in Wyandotte County, but now if Wyandotte County is over 15%, but we're at 5.8%, if it's two different methods, you're not comparing apples and apples again. So where are we with that?
Really excellent question, and I'm happy. I have not gotten a chance to reach out to Wyandotte. I believe KCMO did change to the method we're using when they revamped their dashboard, but I'm not 100% certain on that, but I can certainly reach out to the epidemiologist and get a final answer. But it is an interesting point that we certainly adjusted our method because we were so different from KDHE, but maybe there's some short-sightedness on our...
There's local data
there's also
here
local
for us to be comparing to, because also, I mean, I know WHO recommended if you're over 5% to not have in-person education, and initial guidance from the CDC was much lower numbers. That was then kind of nuanced by the agency later. And so, when you're looking at that from the perspective, okay, well, one umbrella group, so if who's everybody, then that's a very tight percent positivity rate. What method are they using to say if you're over 5%? And I guess in this instance, it wouldn't matter because either way we're over 5%. But then with the CDC initial recommendation being below 5%, which, I mean, again, we're over 5% for either of those. But then if we look at the schools in the East Coast area, I know several of them are shut down. They're saying, okay, we're done at 3%. We're cutting off. So I guess that it's hard to put all these things together. It's like, well, which, I don't know. I'm looking for some guidance on what is it about these mitigating factors here that allows us to do things differently than other agencies would recommend?
I think it's a really fascinating question, and one that I certainly can give you what my thoughts are, but I'm sure if you asked other individuals, and, for instance, maybe the New York City, health commissioner would have very different opinions, right? So let me first say that nobody's tried to do this before, right? So we saw other countries who were able to control the virus a whole lot better than we were, and they were able to reopen at much lower community rates. And so when the WHO is looking at the picture of this globally in a novel pandemic where we still don't know a lot about it, they were able to say, okay, these schools who were able to go back in communities with less than this transmission were successful in doing so. And even before our schools opened up, there had really only been one instance that I'm really familiar with in Israel where we saw a spike in cases after they reopened, but they stopped doing the mitigating factors. They were inside because it was a heat wave. All of the rooms were closed off, they took off their masks, and that's where we saw a spread. And so I think that, again, sort of the same way we had to approach it is you take all the things that are available and you look at it and say, okay, what is actually feasible? I think some of the East Coast schools, particularly the large cities, New York City, they have other pieces that are not pertinent to us. So the fact that a lot of those kids are still riding public transportation to school. There's even more opportunity for transmission in those enclosed spaces of large urban areas. But I think what we have seen, while I will never say that our gating criteria are perfect, I'm not sure there's such a thing. I think thus far, with our mitigating, factors that we've put in place, that all of our school districts have worked exceptionally hard to get done to bring kids back, particularly with the hybrid modes where you are still able to distance. Like I said, we still have not seen, I don't know of a single case, which doesn't mean it hasn't happened, but I don't know of a single case thus far where we have seen a kid that we left in school, so we had an exposure and a kid that we left in school and said it was low risk, where we've started seeing those transmission chains. We've seen a kid get infected from another kid there was an exposure at school. Not to say it didn't happen, not to say that there haven't been cases where somebody has not been tested and this has happened, but I think that we haven't seen our numbers spike since we reopened schools. I think that we've shown that, at least so far, we're doing okay. We're not seeing, most of our, and Shelby can speak to this too, a lot of our staff who are positive, they're almost all community exposures where somebody knew or somebody was out doing something, right? So a lot of our exposures that we're seeing are happening in the community and from people not doing the proper mitigation efforts there. So I don't know that I have a great answer for you other than so far what we're doing seems to be working. In Johnson County, our case rates have remained stable over the last 2 months, 3 months now. We'll see what happens in our school districts that bring back all the kids. But what we have seen is sports are really bad because, not bad, but sports are a main place for transmission because people aren't masked and they're close. So I don't think the answer you're looking for, and I think the reality is we just don't know enough about the virus, and we're all sort of having to make our way. And I think the fact that there has really not been a national strategy or metrics laid out means that everybody's fending for themselves, which is, thankfully so far we're doing well, and we've been very thoughtful, and we've consulted, and we have brilliant individuals and leaders at school districts, at our health department, and the county. So I'm encouraged with where we are. I think it's going better than a lot of people thought it would. This is about what I hoped for. This is what I'd hoped for. So we'll keep watching it. I think the important thing is we're watching data very closely. We're sharing data in real time between the school districts and the health department, where we can look at, are we seeing transmission? Are we seeing these other cases pop up? Are people who are exposed getting infected and then exposing others? And so while we don't have all the answers, what I am confident in is our partnership with the schools to continue to monitor the data of what's going on inside the schools, as well as what's going on in the community, to make any changes as we need to going forward.
I have several more questions, but I will cede my time to allow them to continue to go around the table.
I was just curious if you could speak a little bit about modes of transmission that are more or less worrisome. Because surface transmission, I know early on in COVID, everybody was like spraying everything, and so I guess if you could speak about that, and then also like aerosolized or like ventilation issues, because it's easier for us to tell kids to put a mask on than it is for us to retrofit our whole AC system. So if you could help me think about those, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know there's been a lot recently about aerosolization and airborne transmission, and really what that means is, so the way that we believe COVID is primarily transmitted is on respiratory droplets. And so these are bigger particles of sort of water and moisture that come from your lungs. And that's how the virus sort of hangs out in there and gets transmitted through the air, and somebody else breathes it in, right? The idea behind masks is that those respiratory droplets can't get out through your mask and therefore can't go and infect somebody else, can't be breathed in. The idea behind aerosols is they're smaller, which means they could have a greater likelihood of going through masks and hanging in the air longer and going further to infect people. There's always been some concern that COVID was aerosolized. Some of the early recommendations for hospitals were negative air pressure rooms, which are to guard against aerosolized infections. And there is evidence that it can happen. I'm not at all saying it can't. What I believe, based on the data and the kinds of cases we see, is that if aerosolization was a primary source of transmission, we would see a whole lot more cases than we do in the community. What we see predominantly is the household contacts, those people that you're in really close contact with. Now, I can't say that with 100% confidence, because even by the time we started detecting our cases in Johnson County and in the country, we already had a fair amount of community transmission. We just weren't able to detect it. So it's a little hard to say. But I think based on what we see, like I said, it's a lot of close contacts. That's where we're seeing that transmission. But I do believe that in enclosed spaces with a lack of ventilation, it would not surprise me at all if aerosolization in those sorts of environment become a primary source. Because if there's no ventilation, it can just hang in the air. So I do think that masks have shown to be immensely effective. They're not 100%, but we've seen it time and time again with, I was infected and you were close-ish, but we both had masks on and everything's fine. And we've seen it, in the hairdresser in Springfield, and we've seen it repeatedly in our workplaces here in Johnson County. We have, from the beginning, from about June, said if you're wearing a mask, both parties are wearing a mask, you don't have to quarantine in our workplaces, and we have not seen widespread outbreaks there either. So I still think that respiratory droplets are probably the primary way that COVID is transmitted. Aerosolization can happen, and that's probably where you're going to see some of these super spreader events that we hear about when people are on a bus for a prolonged period and somebody maybe doesn't have great hand hygiene and cough etiquette, and they're just coughing into the air. Surfaces, we really do have learned that not a primary source. We're not saying it can happen, but still keep washing hands. It's good for flu. So I think that, the fact that surfaces aren't a big piece is helps, certainly, particularly for my 4-year-old who puts his hand in his mouth all the time. So yeah, I do think respiratory droplets probably are still the predominant way it spreads. So masks will likely be with us for a while.
So I have a question, Ms. Olshu, about testing and then a follow-up for the district. So do you think we'll get to a point where instead of a 14-day or 10-day quarantine, a negative test would supersede that type of a quarantine?
No. No. So, and quite frankly, we can look at what's going on nationally and see why that is. So take the Patriots, for example, right? So they had a positive, Cam was positive, pretty sure his whole team was probably exposed, right? And they kept testing their people, and they're like, okay, we're going to go play the Chiefs, which is not public health recommendation. But it's because they were testing everybody every day. We're getting those negatives. But then 5 days after Cam's positive, you had another player or two, I didn't keep track, test positive. The only time that that's really good, if you're actually testing every single day, there's maybe something to say for it. But even, I mean, if we look at the White House, we know that those negative tests are not the end all and be all because of the rate of false negatives. And so really the reason why we don't allow testing to get you out of quarantine is because it really can take that 14 days for somebody to develop symptoms. And so if you get tested, say, on day 6 and you're negative, and then you go out in the community, you think you're fine, you start spreading the virus before you're symptomatic. So maybe the next day you start spreading the virus, and then 3 days later you end up with symptoms. And now you've spent 3 days potentially infecting a lot of people when you thought you were fine. But if you just abided by public health recommendation, we could have prevented it. So the fact that it just takes so long, we will probably keep doing this. I don't think there will ever be an opportunity to test out a quarantine. If anything, we might find out more evidence and they may shorten the quarantine period, but even that I think is pretty unlikely.
Okay, thank you. And then my follow-up question, so Shelby, you had mentioned testing an entire class, for example, and I think testing scares some parents, and so how does it look? Are we going to do informed consent, or how does that look in terms of widespread testing in our schools?
Yeah, so what that would probably look like is we would have a positive case in a classroom where there was kids and teachers who were unmasked. So for the majority, that's going to be someone who has a mask exemption for maybe a medical or mental health reason. Some of our special needs kids that come to mind. So when we get a positive, we would likely inform the parents that there's going to be a testing opportunity at day, whatever the health department tells us, day 10 after that exposure. And if they would like their student to be tested, they would have the opportunity. And of course, our staff would have the opportunity to be tested as well.
So parents at home who are worried about, we're not going to force any child to have testing.
We are not allowed to perform any sort of medical procedure on anyone without consent. So our minors in particular, our nurses we would have either a verbal consent from a parent who couldn't be there in person to sign, or we would have those signed consents.
Great, thank you.
I'm thinking about some of the conversation around mitigating factors and ventilation. So as we look at our current rate of cases, and if you just look at the new, average number of new cases that per 100,000, there is prevalence in our community. And so the mitigating factors become more important the more cases you might have in your community. And as we're thinking about kids coming into the classroom, so the more kids you have in the classroom and being in that classroom for a period of time, I'm just thinking about kind of ventilation things like maybe even where before we were keeping doors closed because of other safety factors, are we keeping doors open now to increase? How does that work in circulation in our classrooms, that kind of thing?
So
we're balancing safety concerns.
We continue to work with Children's Mercy Indoor Air Quality. Luke Gard is our liaison there, and they advise us on what we should be doing. And what we're being told right now is that based on all of the actions that our facilities and maintenance people have been able to take, that they do recommend that we keep doors closed right now. And that is because of pulling in the 30% outdoor air, increasing the run time, the fan speeds, all of the things that we've been able to do. Their team is still telling us that they want our doors to be closed.
So
I think
fresh air is circulating in the classroom with the door closed?
It's being pulled in through the HVAC system as opposed to opening a window or opening a door. And we continue to talk with Luke Gard and his team on a weekly basis. I still shoot him questions every now and again, and I still say, hey, are we still following the same guideline? And he, just as early as last week, he sent me another follow-up, just reassuring me, yes, Shelby, this is what we still recommend that you do. And truly, at any given time, if they were to change those recommendations, we would get those out immediately.
Okay, I think it's my turn. Okay. I know nobody can really solidly predict what happens next week, next month, certainly not next spring, but there are, data sets that indicate we are moving into the second wave at this point, and that we are going to be looking at increases, and in particularly our area, that we are at higher risk than some other areas throughout both the country and the world. I think on certain data sets, Kansas City area is ranked like the 22 in the world at like high risk for additional spread. And then in the country is number 10 for that R number being high. So in light of these things, and I'm not certain what it is that puts us at that greater risk. Can you speak to that? Like, what is it about our community at this juncture that puts us at higher risk, or that we're ranked to be on a precipice of potential, significant spread? Can you speak to that? Like, what makes us unique in that regard? Or
So I actually haven't seen those studies or those data sets, so I can't really speak to what they've looked at. I know I've seen some others that have looked at a variety of things that also include socioeconomics and some of those other what we would call social determinants of health that may impact how many people are working frontline jobs and therefore maybe more exposed. So I'd be happy to look at that and get back to you as well with that, because I don't know specifically what was making them pinpoint the
Perfect.
metro.
I'd be happy to email.
That'd be wonderful. Thank you.
Okay.
One other question, and this is sort of for folks at home watching and myself and everyone here. What is the current guidance around when to get kids tested? I feel like we're entering like cold, allergy, flu season, where just this weekend I was on the phone with my sister-in-law who said, he just has a cold, so he's not getting tested. And I thought, I really wonder if he should be getting tested. So what is the, when should parents think about getting their kids tested?
That's a really excellent question. As a parent of a 4-year-old, I get that. So I will say that definitely err on the side of caution. I know that the nasal swabs are very invasive for young kids, and so maybe what may not be great. Children's Mercy does not use the nasopharyngeal. My understanding is they use the mid-terminate, which are not nearly as invasive. Also, the saliva kits are going to be a great opportunity because it's just spitting into a tube.
You guys switched too.
Oh, for the young ones, yeah. And so I think that definitely err on the side of caution. The way I approach it with my own family and with my friends is I would rather know and know that they're negative and I'm not putting anybody at risk than I would sort of think that it's just a cold only to find out in 4 or 5 days it's truly COVID and I've now exposed a bunch of loved ones or family members or friends. And I will say that we've heard a number of times that especially adults and even some youth are saying it was just allergies, right? Like I get allergies every fall, it was just allergies. Only to find out, again, 3 days later when they finally go get tested that it is COVID. And so I think that definitely erring on the side of caution. I will say we do know that other respiratory viruses are out there. Rhinovirus, I was talking to a colleague at Children's Mercy, rhinovirus is showing up on their respiratory viral panel, so another common cold, the same way they're starting to see a little bit of adenovirus. We haven't really seen flu yet in our community, although we've had a couple of cases, but that certainly will be coming too. I would say that, it's a little different now that we're approaching flu season, because when flu hits kids, there are treatment options and things that will need to be decided. And so I think some leaning on that primary care provider who could potentially do a COVID test and a flu test, or COVID test, flu test, and a respiratory viral panel may be really valuable for you, for parents in particular, because it will help differentiate, and that may also have some treatment implications too. So your kid's sick, has some symptoms, and you take them and get COVID tested and it's negative, Maybe it's the flu, maybe it's not. So lean on your primary care providers. Children's Mercy's Nurse Line is a great opportunity too. But the problem is with COVID, particularly in kids, but across the board, is the symptoms just aren't consistent. And so it's really challenging to know which is which.
And I would say from a district perspective, the county has given us the guidelines for when you're symptomatic at school. And so there's like 14 symptoms. And if you have the top four, like loss of sense of taste and smell, fever, cough, shortness of breath, one of those is going to get you sent home if it's new or different for you. If we've seen this before, and we have all kinds of data on these kids from all the years they've been in here. If we've seen it before, if we know this is their normal, then that's fine. We're not going to send them home. But if it's new or different for them, then they have the opportunity to go see their doctor and get a differential diagnosis. They can get a negative COVID test, or they can stay home the 10 days.
I just have a general question. So it was brought up in public comment about just our resolution regarding COVID. And as I look at it, it does say resolved that the Shawnee Mission Board of Education affirms the school reopening plan designed to ensure that the district has a safe plan to deliver instruction with the staff, resources, technology, space, policies, and protocols required for the health, safety, and well-being of all students and staff to be informed by actionable criteria by CDC, KDHE, and JCDHE. So we have chosen to follow JCDHE and its gating criteria. Although it doesn't specifically say that in our resolution, is it worth revisiting our resolution at some point to, specify that we are indeed following JCDHE, to be a little bit more specific? I don't know, I'm just throwing that out there as a general question. Any thoughts?
Well, I think at this point, it's already in line with the other entities. Based off of tonight's presentation and my understanding of comments from Dr. Fulton, it wouldn't change how we operate to alter the resolution at this point. It doesn't change where we're at. So if we were to vote to say we're specifically following JCDHE, it might actually be more limiting down the line if somebody else has additional information, like from the CDC, if there's a national approach in 2 months, or I don't know.
Yeah.
But I think at this point right now, the whereas resolution is permitting Dr. Fulton to follow, or for the cabinet to follow JCDHE's gating criteria, and which was up until recently the more conservative, and now is in line with everything else. And so I don't know that it alters anything to do anything with the resolution at this point. And I think sometimes it gets people, it might get people in the community to think that something different would happen if we were to vote on it again. The expectation that if you're voting on it, it would change something somehow. And since it doesn't, now I could be misinterpreting that or interpreting that inaccurately, but maybe could you speak to that, Dr. Fulton? Would it change anything if we were to vote on the resolution?
Turn this on. From my perspective, we're definitely following the JCDHE gating criteria. So it certainly wouldn't change my behavior unless I was directed to do something other than that. I don't know if that answers either of your questions adequately, but
is there enough difference between the KSDE's guidance and JCDHE's guidance that there's enough daylight between the two of them it strikes me that they're very similar. If we were to say we're following KSDE and not JCDHE, it wouldn't do anything to change anything where we're at right now. We would still be in an orange. We would still be having secondary available in a hybrid form.
There's some nuances of difference. One of the things that they look at is absenteeism, which is not part of the JCDHE criteria. Now, the fact that absenteeism is not built into one of the indicators doesn't mean that we're not paying attention to it, because obviously if you get to high rates of absenteeism, it does impact whether or not we feel like we can continue to have school. And really, when you're talking about absenteeism, you really are drilling down into the school level. It wouldn't be a blanket statement across the entire district in all likelihood. That would actually not be any different than what we've done in the past, where you get into, incidents of flu, unless it just takes on life of its own, and every school is having major issues with it. One of the things, and I think this partly addresses a question that I really appreciate on this updated dashboard, is the fact that we don't have to determine what gating criteria we're in. They give us the color, and because we're meeting weekly, we know whether that color is likely to change either into red or down to yellow. The other piece that's really nice with this change is that it allows us to stabilize the learning environment that we're in. So, in the past, what is now orange and what's red, we couldn't do hybrid. Now we can do hybrid, and we can continue to engage in hybrid in orange and yellow. So it's likely the data's going to sit between orange and yellow quite a bit, the way things look right now. I'll have Elizabeth speak to that, but that gives us a smoother path to keep instruction stable. And if we're going to be in hybrid for quite a while, and we could be at the secondary level, then we need to just really work that model and continue to evolve it so we get better and better at doing a hybrid approach. Good thing is we can keep students in as long as we maintain vigilance on these mitigating factors that we know work to keep the spread down. I don't know, Elizabeth, if you want to add to that or not.
Nope, I think you're spot on. I think that the stability of learning is obviously something that we were very concerned about, and something I've cautioned other individuals as we've looked at how people define increasing or decreasing, or depending on what they're using, is trying to prevent that whiplash, because there needs to be stability for a multitude of reasons. So I think that, to Dr. Fulton's point, this helps with that, along with, as long as those mitigating factors are in place.
I might add, too, going back historically just a little bit, we talked several weeks ago about, maybe it's been a month or so ago now, I don't know. Time goes by quickly. Talk about those questions that I posed to JCDHE around protocols. What protocols would allow us to have school or do sports if you're in certain rates of transmission. And I think one of the things I've appreciated about them is that we never talked about how we could get to a color. We talked about, if you're in this color, what do you have to do to make sure that this isn't spreading? How do we do this safely? And the answer could be, there are no protocols in which you do it safely. And if that's the answer, that's the answer. But I think they've really worked hard at trying to help us in our partnership to think through what may be possible to keep students and staff safe. And so anyway, I just want to thank you for doing that, because I think it's been a really good partnership. I don't know. That's a really long answer.
No,
I don't know if that answered your question.
No, I think the public comment made earlier, I think, it raised a question in my mind as well. Do we need to be more specific in our resolution? Because it does say, that we're following multiple agencies, which we are. I mean, we're following CDC and classrooms. So I think, just the public acknowledgement that we are following JCDHE. We're not trying to move a goalpost. Am I interpreting that correctly? I mean,
Right.
If I can add to that, I think that's a really important point, because, one of the things that we talked about 2 board meetings ago was this notion of, perhaps adding KSDE and KSHA, the state sports organization, into the gating criteria solely for the purpose of a recognition that we do use aspects of their planning processes and documents to inform our work here. But we also mentioned at that same meeting that we intended to continue to follow the JCDHE gating criteria. So I do think at every step that we need to keep emphasizing that we are working in partnership with JCDHE. We're following their gating criteria, and we're working hand in hand with them weekly to make sure that we're doing what we need to do to make this work for all students.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Hi. Earlier, you said you had some discomfort with the idea of secondary being back in full, and I fully anticipate that we are going to hear from folks shortly who will want to move from hybrid into full. And so I'd like a clear description of what the risks associated with that are and why the recommendation at this juncture is hybrid, and why it would remaining in hybrid is JCDHE's position on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have to look at community transmission. So that's why we do gating criteria based at a community level, right? Because the amount of community transmission will impact how many people are walking into the school buildings positive for COVID, how many people have it. And in particular, with secondary schools, there are a couple of things that makes that more concerning than elementary schools. One is they're far more likely to be out in the community, getting exposed at multiple different areas, whether that's athletics, part-time jobs, friends and social gatherings. So already, if you think about the kinds of risks in general that secondary kids are being exposed to in elementary, secondary has higher risks. We also know that, at least based on the science, it appears still that elementary school kids, those 10 and younger, they can spread it. We've never said they can't, but they don't seem to spread it in sort of larger settings. They spread it in their households, but not as much in daycares or other places. We have seen really good success in our daycares without having transmission there. And so we know that as you get older, there seems to be more of a risk of transmitting the virus as well. So you combine both of those things, and then you put these individuals, these adolescents, into classrooms that don't have maybe even 3 feet of space, or, and I've seen some classrooms where they're, stacked on next to each other on a bench working or something like that. And also figuring that we're going to have more cases who are positive. So it's this law of numbers, and the fact that we know that masks are not 100% effective, but the more people you have who are positive for COVID, the greater likelihood that the mask wearing is going to fail. Like, the mask wearing is not going to protect you because you have that many more people who are pushing virus into the air and allowing other people to breathe it in. So the more positives you have, the greater likelihood is that our mitigation effort's not going to work in general. But then also you combine that with having kids in close proximity to each other, and then the changing of classrooms, where you really do run the risk of, if you have this situation, you have the potential of far more individuals being exposed. And then the other piece of this, which I've said to Dr. Fulton and the health service coordinators repeatedly, is that I have every confidence, especially at the hybrid level, particularly with secondary, that you guys can do everything you can and will prevent transmission within the classroom. The masking you guys are great about, the distancing you guys are great about, the protocols, the seating charts, all of those things will help prevent transmission. But the thing you can't control is what happens when the bell rings. And so the moment those masks come off in the parking lot, those are then opportunities for spread that may not. So it's just the number of opportunities for transmission when you bring all the kids back, and particularly individuals who are far more likely to spread it than, say, their elementary counterparts, the greater the likelihood is that you're going to have that transmission occur in the classroom or within the school from several different individuals. And so I would love to be proven wrong. We'll start seeing as one of our school districts is bringing back all of their kids in secondary school. But the fact that the changing of the classrooms, the proximity to one another, as well as the increased risk that they are infected and can transmit it efficiently, all combine to provide me that discomfort when I think about secondary kids in full person.
Thank you. Sarah, do you have any? Jessica?
Oh, I keep getting Sarah's turns. Not really. I'm interested, knowing this is the second iteration of a dashboard that you've done, and knowing that multiple districts have their own district level or school level dashboards, and I think it's something I'd love to see SMSD do. Do you have any advice for what those dashboards could, just lessons learned, to share with us, or from other districts?
I have to be very honest. I have not really gotten an opportunity to look at a lot of school districts' dashboards, but I've heard that they're there, and I think they're excellent opportunities for transparency, not transmission. JCDHE has decided that we're going to stay out of the game of posting cases in our school districts. And I think that that's made a lot easier by school districts doing it themselves. I've heard North Kansas City has a really great one, that school district. I've also heard one of our school districts, and I feel badly, I can't remember which, are looking at the number of like cases to contact ratio and who's getting infected. And so I think some of those that maybe don't necessarily even have to be pushed out, but still data that are looked at. I think you just need to be very intentional and be very thoughtful, and that's maybe something we did not have the time and space to do when we pushed out our first dashboard, because there was a lot of pressure and we were, a month into a pandemic here. So I think, yeah, I've learned that people are very interested. We've had probably now almost 2 million hits in our dashboard since April. And so just being very transparent about how data are being counted and how they're being collected. And then obviously, you guys all know this, right? The privacy piece, that's something we really struggle with too, is what we release and how much that puts somebody at risk for, them being identified.
We had a meeting the other, last week with our health partners. Elizabeth was part of that. Was that last week or the week?
Yeah, last week.
Last week. And, going back to the previous board meeting, we talked about the notion of the dashboard. And one of the concerns I shared at that board meeting was some of the examples that I've seen are reporting very low ends. So, for example, when you start reporting at the building level, that gets highly problematic because your ends are very low. And Elizabeth, we were talking about this the other day where really, we know this from statistics, you should have a minimum on the number of ends that you actually report before you do any reporting. So we have a team that is working on a dashboard. We know that's something that people want. It does promote transparency. Now let me add a piece about transparency, because here's one of the things that you hear sometimes. It's transparent at times as long as I get the data that I want. But if you don't give me the data that I want, then it's not transparent. And here's what I mean by that. The dashboards that I've seen from larger districts that seem to do, I think, that I've been impressed with, tend to focus on district or perhaps even grade cluster level reporting, like elementary, middle school, high school. They don't focus on individual building data. So what am I going to be most interested in as a parent? I want to know what my building looks like. But again, the problem you get into is you're getting into very small ends in some cases. Sorry, hit my microphone. So that's part of what we're working through is what data are meaningful, stable, understood. Like, for example, are we talking about rate of transmissions that are identified and they occur within the school? Or are we talking about positive cases that have occurred within the school population that may or may not have occurred as a result of being in school? In other words, we know through contact tracing these things actually happen. They were actually contracted outside of school. So those are the kinds of as we're doing our data build for the dashboard, those are the kinds of questions that we're putting on the table so that when we release it, we can talk about the why. Why are you reporting this level of data but not maybe a deeper level of data? So yes, I do think getting a dashboard up is really important, but I also think doing it right and being clear about what you are and are not going to report is equally important. So we've got a team working on it. I think it's especially important now that we start bringing children back into school that we're reporting that out. So that's why we have a sense of urgency about it. And we have some good regional models to look at. So the only other thing I'll add to that is, one of the discussions is, are you updating it real time, or are you doing episodes? A week or 2 weeks of reporting. That's a little bit more static. It's a little bit easier to manage something that isn't continually being updated on a live basis. Not to say we couldn't, but if you're going to do that, then you have to stay on top of it. And that's all internal staff doing it. So we want to do it right. We want to be informative, and we want people, when they see the data, to say, oh, well, that makes sense. I understand what I'm actually looking at here. So I don't know, Shelby or Elizabeth, if you want to add to that.
No, think that you're completely right. I think that, when we unveiled our initial dashboard, we were being very responsive to, what the asks were and the changing view of the pandemic along each step. And so I think just being very thoughtful and understanding the why, I think are all very important things. And the daily updates become hard too, because everybody's checking the dashboard every day, and every time something happens that maybe isn't expected, or maybe it's just happenstance of the person who was doing the feed, who's reporting from that school that day was out, and so all of a sudden you see a drop, whatever it may be, people become very reactionary with the data. And so sometimes I think that a more stable week over week is a better move. And some of the things that we're planning on doing for our dashboard, for parts of our dashboard, is going to a less frequent update.
And I guess just a question for our team as we think through it, is this question of having athletics included in that? Just if we're having 42 kids quarantined from a football game, how we think about including that.
Yeah, that's part of the challenge that we're trying to think through. How do you reflect that? Because that's 42 students, right? But within a very defined context, and yet you don't want to personally identify them. Those are the sorts of things that we're having to think through in terms of how we report that out in the public domain.
Yeah, I agree with that. Just if you're going to report 42 students, and it's just a number, but as a parent, that seems like a high number depending on the size of your school. We really have to be thoughtful about, are we going to report that this isn't an athletic cohort, which seems, in my mind, that would lower anxiety. But then again, you're personally identifying somebody. So you just have to think it all through. And I think, as we said earlier, going a little slower, I feel, is always the right approach. We don't need to rush into this and do something that could potentially just not be the right decision.
Ms. Borgman? You're good? Anybody? Okay, it's back to me. On the hospital beds, I noticed that we haven't been reporting, or Johnson County hasn't been reporting the hospital bed capacity on the dashboard. Is there a lag on that? Is there a reason why we don't know what our hospital bed capacity is? Or do we know and it's in flux and so it's not updated, or?
So we actually are directing individuals to the MARC dashboard now. So when the federal government switched the data source from CDC's National Health Safety Network reporting system to the Health Protect, I can't remember if that's the name of it, the HHS version, we lost our data feed at the local health department at Johnson County. And so MARC has been able to get access to that data. We have not been able to get direct access. And so MARC's data is up to date. It has a Johnson County specific tab that you can click on, and you can actually get there from our dashboard. On the main page, if you look at hospitalizations, there's a link under it to get to regional hospitalization data.
Do you know what the rate is right now?
It's actually been holding pretty steady for COVID patients, although, I keep hearing some of these rumblings that the beds are fuller, like our hospitals are fuller, but it's not so much COVID related. So I think that our hospital capacity has continued to look very good, with a very small percentage of both our bed usage and our ICU usage and our ventilator usage due to COVID.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Is that everybody? Okay. Thank you very much for coming this evening.
Thank you all.
It's appreciated.
Elizabeth, we thank you so much for being here. And I think I told her once we were done with this part of it, I think you probably want to go home.
I will admit, I am looking forward to it. Thank you all for having me, and thank you. I know you all have been very intentional and thoughtful about your approaches to bringing kids back, and I commend Dr. Fulton and the health services team for being very on top of it and doing what needs to be done to keep staff and students in our community safe. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and then now for
Here are consent items.
Nope,
wait,
I've still got just a couple more quick.
Oh, okay, all
quick
right.
Update.
Sorry.
That's why I emphasize quick update. Quick update.
I was like,
yeah, a couple things.
that was a lot.
This will be really fast. Just a really quick update on elementary and secondary. First of all, I just want to thank our students, our parents, and our staff for Well, you know, their patience. This has been one really rough start to the school year for everybody, not just here, but in districts throughout our country. And so I just want to thank everybody for hanging in there. We're at a point now with elementary, as you know, where we've been phasing them in to all in-person instruction. That phase-in will be completed by the week of October 26th, in which we'll have all students in pre-K through 6. And I want to commend the teachers and for the great work that they're doing. I've had a chance to get out to some of the elementary schools, and I know they're working through a lot of logistical details, especially lunch, building entry and exit, but they're doing a wonderful job. And I know they're excited about the students coming in, as they're also being thoughtful about how to do this in the right way. So many thanks to the teachers for their great work, as well as our parents and students for their patience as we work through this. At the secondary level, we are going to start hybrid on October 26th. They too have been doing a fantastic job of designing up a hybrid approach. As I mentioned earlier, it's likely as long as we're in orange or yellow, then we'll be able to stay in hybrid for secondary. And that hybrid is, I think, by anyone's understanding, not the perfect model. But it does allow us to have in-person instruction. And I also believe that as we get started with hybrid, our understanding of how to do hybrid well will evolve over time. I think we'll get better at hybrid as time goes on. So a couple of things related to that as awareness. As you probably remember, we are dividing students into 2 cohorts by last name. We did this with elementary, and we're going to do it with secondary too. We are on Monday and Tuesday, students with last names A through LAMB will attend in person, and then the rest of the students will work remotely via Canvas and WebEx. Now, we are encouraging teachers to offer an opportunity for remote students to view classroom instruction remotely during via WebEx. Now, that is going to look different classroom by classroom. That will be easier to do in some settings than others. We recognize that. We also recognize that you could have students who are due to go on a Monday or Tuesday who may be quarantined at home. That's going to happen. And so, you know, we want to think about ways to reach out to them, especially on those days, or students with other kinds of issues that may prohibit them from coming. So what I want to emphasize is, at the secondary level especially, it's very different than elementary. It's not a one-size-fits-all when it comes to instruction. Think about everything from a math class where I know math teachers, you know, meeting every day is, I taught math, meeting every day is by far preferred versus having every other day or something like that. Doing a chemistry lab is different than doing a journalism class or modern language or anything else. So there's a lot of design work to do. I have great faith in our building administrators and our professional staff, our teachers, to both get this thing off on a good start, but also to creatively problem solve ways to engage students in effectively in hybrid learning. But I know it's going to be a journey. You know, the first week won't look like the second week or the third week. And I know our teachers will do their very best to make sure that our students get the learning that they need. We'll be following all the health and safety protocols that are required to be in hybrid, particularly while we're in orange, which is really no different than if we're in yellow. At the middle school level, and I'm not going to spend much time on these, this just gives you a taste of what a hybrid schedule might look like at the middle school, what a bell schedule might look like at the middle school. And at the high school, kind of gives you an idea of what those days look like in terms of the block classes that are going on, and then a hybrid schedule. So I thought it might be good just to get a quick update on where we are with elementary and secondary. And I'm sure that I'll be able to be in a much better position to give you an update down the road on how learning's going at both the elementary and middle school and high school levels as we move along. So be happy to respond to any questions, but I don't have a whole lot more to report than just that.
Do we want to, does anybody have any questions?
I just have one that I felt like I needed to ask, which is just around subs, because I've heard a lot in the last week. In fact, my own son's teacher couldn't find a sub Friday, so we just had like a to-do list. And I know subs are a major issue in SMSD and district-wide, but I wanted to ask that question.
Yeah, Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, so we continue to work with Kelly Staffing. The pool is great. Now, what's been the difference since we've moved to hybrid is we've started utilizing those daily subs. And so not speaking to your specific situation, but we do have those 2 building subs at each of the buildings. And so we're asking those subs to work in the remote capacity. And then if an in-person teacher needs a substitute, to use those daily subs. I haven't heard, not to say that it hasn't happened, I haven't heard that those daily subs couldn't be filled. So I would certainly continue to work with Kelly on that. But to share your concern, I have the same concern. So as we get more isolations and quarantines, we're going to have those issues. What we're asking our teachers to do, our professional staff to do, if they're willing to, and they're healthy and they can do it, if they're in isolation or quarantine, to continue to teach remotely, continue to teach our kids, because that's going to be the best thing for our students. And then we'll backfill that position with a sub in the classroom so that they can continue to work with our kids and teach remotely. But it's, again, going to fall back on, can we find that sub? Kelly keeps working. We have a large pool. So I'll remain confident that we'll be able to do that.
I actually had just one clarification, because we have had a couple of families reach out who signed up for in-person under the previous gating criteria, but who now have trepidation or reason to believe that they don't want their child to be going back in person under the new gating criteria. But with the WebEx classes available to monitor online, they could potentially make accommodations with their principal if they reached out to their principal and explained their needs as a family, that they could work on alternatives there, so that then they could sign up for the online cadre in the spring if we're still in that situation, but to bridge from here to that situation, that there's possibilities available.
Yeah, principals have done a really good job of working with individual cases like that. So, and there's going to be a lot of challenges as we go through this year. I think quarantine is probably going to provide the greatest challenge that we're going to face throughout the year. That we're going to have to find ways to creatively solve the problem of keeping learning going for all kids. So that's something that it's a problem we're just going to have to keep solving, day by day, week by week.
Okay. All right, well, now it looks like we might be able to move to the consent items. So I'm not seeing any final questions. Thank you, Dr. Fulton. I'll seek a motion for our consent agenda.
Move approval. Goodburn.
Thank you, Ms. Goodburn. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Stratton. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? Okay, hearing none, that passes unanimously. And then we can go around the table and have our board comments this evening. Ms. Embry, would you like to start us off?
No comments.
Okay. Okay, I just have a brief comment. I know we have been reached by some folks who have expressed concerns about the mascots in the district, and specifically at Shawnee Mission North. And prior to the semester starting, we had communicated with folks that once the semester began, we had hoped to, following our strategic plan and diversity and inclusion as a priority, that we were going to be making meaningful progress on that. And I do want to reiterate that in light of the fact that it is Indigenous Peoples Day, and that is something that is being worked on. I know there is so much going on in the district that it's hard to keep track of all the things that are happening. But, the students is something the students are talking about. I know that like the Indian Lore Journal is updating their name, and with students coming back in at the end of the month, that is going to be a conversation that is had, and that that community. So I just wanted to make sure that people knew that that was not something that had fallen off the radar. COVID is, of course, sucking all of the oxygen out of the room in so many regards, but there are still things that we do as a board and as a district that have impact and positive things for our students. So I just wanted to mention that, and I'll move it on to Dr. Sinclair.
I would say one takeaway from tonight's conversation was the impact of community transmission on our capacity in the schools to uphold the safety component of this reopening plan. And that I would just urge our folks in the Shawnee Mission community to do what's within your reach to promote the use of those mitigating factors. So it includes, wearing masks, distancing, physically distancing when you're together socially, wearing masks, and hand hygiene. That's so critical that out of school time, after school time, that we as a community come together to really try to manage the community transmission rate. And also to, in kind of just the role of advocacy, to continue not so much on pressing the changing of the gating criteria, but of reaching back to our electeds at the county level, the state level, and the federal level to make sure we have the capacity to test and identify who is sick, and we have the resources to manage those logistics if we're going to implement them, and that there's access to masks and those kinds of things that help us remain safe. There's work that can be done that way in ensuring that we have what we need to keep our folks safe and in school, because we can bring people back, but if we can't keep people in, it can't keep people safe, we can't keep them in. We really need to keep our staff and our students safe. So that's my plug. And I guess one other piece is to remind folks that our educators and our building staff really only came back in mid-August. So there hasn't been 6 months to plan and figure all this out. First we had to find out how many students and where our teachers were, and then build from that. So I applaud all of our building leadership, building staff, in adapting and doing what they can to meet the needs of our learners. So thank you.
No comment tonight.
I just want to remind people that the SMAC PTA Reflections Art Contest is happening, and I think the deadline is coming up for student submissions. But this is one of my favorite things to do as a board member, is to see all the wonderful creations that our students come up with. And this year's theme is I Matter Because. So I'm really excited to see what our students are going to do to interpret that theme. And I just want to encourage them, be creative, and we'd love to see what you create. We love to display it here in this building and in your school buildings. So if you haven't thought about entering something in the Reflections Contest, I hope that students will consider doing that. And that's all I have.
I wanted to thank and give a shout out to the student speaker tonight, Peyton Cook. Thank you, Peyton, for coming and speaking to the board. I know that takes a lot of courage to come up and speak your mind and give the board feedback. And so I really appreciate it. And Peyton printed out her speech and then also provided feedback from some other students. And so Peyton, I just wanted to again say thank you for doing all that. Thank you for going the extra mile for making all these copies for board members. And it does address some learning feedback, and so hopefully in future board meetings we can take a deeper dive into how learning is going in Shawnee Mission. So Peyton, we are going to, we hear you and we thank you for your feedback to us. Also, just shout outs to all the awesome first day of school pictures for elementary students. It was really fun to see kids getting back into school, and teachers, thank you so much for all you do. You're working around the clock, and I am so very grateful for you. October is also Breast Cancer Awareness Month, and I work in the oncology space. And guess what? Breast cancer still happens even during a pandemic. So for women over the age of 40. If you have not had your mammogram, please go get it done. I have 2 friends right now who are battling breast cancer. And so, you know, it's a real thing, and please make sure that you take care of yourself. So, thanks.
I have one more thing before we scooch out. The Education Foundation notified all of the students who got scholarships, and man, it was nice to see those photos. Hard to not be there in person, but to see those kids doing, you know, really remarkable things and having all those opportunities. And so, Ms. Embry, when is the Education Foundation's breakfast again?
It is on Election Day, November 3rd. It is,
Excellent.
sign-ups are available now. It's going to be virtual.
It's
for
virtual,
sure.
but we can buy our tickets online at the foundation's website, and you know, they're helping our families in need during this time of COVID. They're providing resources for the classrooms, and then obviously the scholarship program is a wonderful feel-good. And so I almost forgot right before we were getting out. I was like, no, just one more plug for that, to go buy your tickets and follow their Twitter feed if you need something that brings you joy in your life when you get on social media. No further business this evening. We don't have an executive session, and so we next meet on the 26th. Thank you, everyone.